All right. Well, welcome to the aftermath. Now that we've spent many hours and details documenting all of the nefarious schemes of the devil in the first 300 or 400 years of the church, it's time to see how all of these things played out through time and eventually convinced the rest of the world. That's a very important point because, again, people believe that these things happened quickly and suddenly, but really they were gradually and locally, and they dispersed outward. Satan leveraged his throne through Rome, through Constantine, and then once the sleight of hand was complete, propaganda and enforcement began to go out throughout the Roman Empire and the rest of the Christian world. But it took time. It took a lot of time, and that's another important thing to document, which is what we're going to be doing in this section. People think that Christians kept the Sabbath on Sunday since the very beginning in the book of Acts, but this is not true whatsoever, folks. Hopefully you have learned that. It's nonsense. Satan had to use dialectics to prepare people, to prepare the mindset, to prepare the culture for the ultimate shindig, to reinterpret God's laws. That took a lot of dialectics so that seems justified. While also, he needed to give it a lot of time so that previous generations would die off. The apostles would never allow this. Do you understand? The apostles would have never allowed such a thing. So it had to go over successive generations, and Satan was extremely patient and cunning because he's the most subtle creature that God ever made. Then obviously came the shaping of the culture with the influencers after the apostles passed away, and the persecutions, the political frameworks through the standardization of the calendar by Constantine, peace and reconciliation with the Roman Empire that gave people the false sense of relief and safety, and of course, that successive councils and things that came after that we covered in the last section, and you'll see some more in this section. And eventually in 538, the Pope became the Grand Poobah that was appointed by Justinian to be the corrector of heresies and the main, basically, controller of the church. And that began the 1260 period of Bible prophecy, which ended in the mortal wound when the Pope was arrested by Berthier, Napoleon's general, and declared to be at an end. But of course, the papacy didn't end. It came back. During that period of time, the 1260 period, which is what we're going to be covering for the most part here, but also some more things even past that. During that period of time, the papacy consistently maximized sin on the earth because the papacy is the seat of Satan. So Satan, every generation with every new pope, maximized sin through proclamations, through asserting his power and dominance, and everything else that we've covered many times before, especially if you've watched my Dominum Deum Nostrum Papam series. Today, very importantly, we are past the healing of the mortal wound politically, because in 1929, the Lateran Pact gave all of the papal territories, created the Vatican back to the papacy, and ever since then, the papacy has been coming back into the world as this power that people look to for morality, for control, for advice, for everything else. So, the end of this journey is going to be a return to medieval Catholicism and understanding how medieval Catholicism treaded on the saints, persecuted people that didn't obey, called them heretics, called them antichrists, gaslit people, justified its authority with all sorts of smoke and mirrors. You have to understand that history so that you understand where we are going in the coming years. So, today we have a lot of history to understand because we are at the end of history, and that's the point of looking at these things. People who advocate for Sunday need to revisit this history, this very inconvenient history, because they're obeying the Antichrist power on the earth that changes the times and laws. And that power is not only coming into the world, it will be in the world again and demanding obedience very soon. It's always been about obedience, friends. So make sure you're obeying the right Lord when you rest on the Lord's day. We saw in the previous section that Satan's attack was multifold and also gradual. Again, just for the sake of understanding, I'm going to repeat these things so that they are drilled into your mind. You're dealing with persecution by the Jews originally, and then basically persecution by the Romans. Both of these made Christians hate Jews and not want to associate to anything Jewish for hundreds of years. While this was happening, you had the influx of pagan converts, philosophers, Gnostics, thinkers, that took over the church from the apostles and the Jewish disciples and shaped it with their own ideas and traditions of how things should be done and everything else, because there was no overarching leadership. There were elders, but remember that the majority of people that were coming in were pagan, and they replaced the Jewish elders that originally were there. You also had Gnosticism, which was a thread that's always been around, but specifically in the church age, that pulled at Christians to apostatize, and even the ones that didn't created dialectics with fasting on Saturday and everything else to not be Jewish and to slight the Jews and so on. So that was another thread that Satan was using. Fasting controversies and traditions in general were also another thread, because people were arguing about, well, don't fast like the Jews. We're Christians now, fast, Wednesdays and Fridays. And in general, that whole thing attributed to people basically separating more and more from their Jewish traditions and background and everything else. I'm not saying you need to keep the Passover, but ultimately, it's important to realize that the original church was Jewish. And that means that they kept the Sabbath. And that was increasingly more separated and separated and separated through all of these dialectics, like fasting, Gnosticism, persecution, and so on. Eventually, you had the union of paganism with Christianity by Constantine, by allowing the space for people to not be persecuted, so they're feeling relieved, and they're much more motivated to comply with state legislature and laws so that they don't go back to being persecuted. And Constantine provided the precedent to begin resting on Sunday. His law was a pagan law, acting in the service of his pagan god to honor paganism. And it wasn't an all-encompassing law, and it certainly wasn't enforced with the sword like crazy, but it set the precedent. It was the sleight of hand that transferred the resting aspect, the sabbatical aspect, from the seventh day to the first day. And then ever since then, it became more and more successively implemented in the culture, where eventually you saw people like Eusebius, the Council of Laodicea, and all of these successive councils and authorities say, no, we're resting on Sunday now because that's the Christian day. And of course, that came from Rome. Rome was the epicenter of this idea. You will see today very clearly that the entire Christian world did not agree with this. And it took hundreds of years for everybody to fall in line and completely abandon the Sabbath and come to Sunday sacredness as a unified thing. By the Protestant Reformation, it was already a done deal, and we'll look a little bit at that too. But nevertheless, these things by Constantine emboldened the authorities to promote this new thing and condemn Sabbath keepers. Because why? Because they wanted to be friends with the world. What does James say? Friendship with the world is enmity with God, and this is exactly the problem. They compromised, and that is why the compromised church is the third church, and it began this whole thing. So all of these tactics, combined with the dark to light of the persecutions, the legalizations, and false apostles, corruptions, politics, you name it. The mystery of iniquity was very active from the very beginning, and it culminated after a full assault of 300 years in Constantine creating that sleight of hand, and then from then on, which is what we're covering in this section, going forward into the Roman Empire and convincing people with more and more dialectics. Just when you thought the dialectics were coming to an end, they're not, folks. They're never coming to an end until Jesus returns, and that's the truth. So by the 4th and 5th century and beyond, which is what we're looking at today, the church looked very different. And hopefully you see that the church in the 5th century or the 6th century looked extremely different than the church in the 1st century and the 2nd century. Catholics and Orthodox claim that they have an unchanging lineage back to the apostles, and especially if you're Orthodox, we haven't changed a thing since the apostles, which of course is not true. It's patently false. One of the easy clues is that the original church kept the Passover and the Sabbath, which of course the Orthodox do not do. There's so many doctrines and traditions and words of men that have been added in the last 2,000 years that it's not even close to similar. Whether you're Orthodox or Catholic, you're not even close to the original church. The hierarchy is completely different. All of the doctrines and transubstantiation and Mary veneration and icons and statues, there's nothing similar about, other than just the name, maybe being Christian, than the first century church and the modern church. So this is why the main three arguments to defend Catholicism or orthodoxy or religion in general are generally appealing to the following three things. They appeal to half-truths in history, where they cherry-pick church father statements and various things to make it seem that, oh, this is what people thought back then. As you have clearly seen that, this is not the case. Any church father, no matter when they lived, was never the representative sample of the majority. That's an important point. So they appeal to half-truths. Number two is that they appeal to conjectures. This is especially applicable to the Catholics with their apostolic succession. Apostolic succession is a conjecture. There is no such thing as apostolic succession. There's no writings in the New Testament regarding apostolic succession. There's one verse, and it's taken completely out of context and inverted to make a particular narrative. And of course, you have Rome's own documents, like that Liber Pontificalis, or whatever we looked at, that was written in the 6th century. Oh, look at all these popes that we've had since the beginning. That's nonsense. So that's a conjecture. And of course, they both also appeal to tradition as authority over the scriptures. You'll often hear from Catholics and Orthodox that the church gave us the Bible, the oral tradition and so on. Everything that God ever wanted to be doctrine was written down. Because that way, there's evidence. And you have a consistent record. And you know what to compare what somebody says with the written word. And when somebody says something that is contradictory to the written word, then you know that the thing that that person is saying is not true. That's the point. So the whole thing about the church giving us the Bible is just not true whatsoever. The Bible, for them, is never a primary source, unfortunately, but they rather use religion as a lens to interpret the Bible and to read religion backwards through time and justify, of course, the status quo. People who are in religion, especially Catholicism and Orthodoxy, they have to make these first 300 years seem institutional. Do you get it? They have to do their best to craft a narrative with cherry-picked statements from church fathers and, forgeries like Ignatius and whatever else, Liber Pontificalis. They have to use all of these extra documents that most of them are completely irrelevant historically in terms of showing you what actually was happening. And they cherry-pick those statements and they construct a narrative to show you, look, the church was always like this, which of course is not true. You've seen what a full assault Satan attacked the church with. In Revelation 12, it says, woe to you on the earth, he's come down in great fury because he knows his time is short. So yeah, Satan was in great fury after being defeated and thrown down to earth. So he did not waste a single minute with assaulting the church and doing all the dialectics he did, which means that the first 300 years was not this stable, consistent structure. It was in complete flux from one original thing, which was very decentralized and Jewish largely in tradition, to a centralized pagan mystery religion that parades around as Christianity. Hopefully you can see all that by now and why all of these things are so easily refuted when we look at history clearly and we look at history with a fine-tooth comb. Not cherry-picking church fathers, but looking at the majority of the things that they're saying in whole. Now, I want to start with Pope Innocent, because Pope Innocent proclaimed a Sabbath fast on, I think it was like 401 or 402 or something. Some people argue that Pope Sylvester did this in 325. Again, there's not a whole heck of a lot of evidence. There is some, but either way, the point is that whether Sylvester actually proclaimed a fast, or maybe he proclaimed a fast just a couple of times of the year, or maybe some even people say that he even relaxed the Sabbath fast and restricted it only to Easter Sunday. It doesn't matter. The point is that it's still very early in church history, and now it's becoming an official teaching to fast on the Sabbath. Only a couple hundred years later, and now it's becoming an official teaching of the church to basically profane the Sabbath and make it a burden. So this began a very important dialectic, especially with Innocent, because we have that very well documented in the year 400 something, that would culminate in the Great Schism. you'll see how this Sabbath fasting issue is not going away. It's not going away until the year 1000 or so, where the Great Schism happened. So the first thing I want to show you is a book by Martin Connell, and the title is Church Worship in the 5th Century Rome, the letter of Innocent I to Decentius of Gubbio. So this book basically documents this situation with Innocent, and I believe it was written in not the book, but the letter was written in 416 AD. So we're going to look on page 36 to 37 of the PDF, and let's see what we can learn. Oh gosh, it's a little too zoomed in. There you go. Okay, let's see, what did I highlight? 34, there we go. Actually, it's going to be 37 to 38. On the Saturday fast. So this is the Latin on the one side, and this is the translation of the letter that Innocent I wrote. Reason clearly states that Saturday should indeed be a day of fasting. The beast is speaking. For if we celebrate the Lord's Day because of the sacred resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, we do not so only at Easter, but also on the image of that day in the weekly cycle. Then surely we should frequently observe that other day throughout the cycle of each week also, for if we fast on Friday because of the passion of the Lord, we should not overlook Saturday, which is enclosed between the time of sadness and the time of rejoicing. For during those 2 days the apostles were in mourning and were hiding out of fear of the Jews. Let there be no doubt then that about commemorating by fasting during these 2 days, because the tradition of the Church maintains that the sacraments are strictly not to be celebrated in this 2-day span. Is that the case? Or were you privy to other information where people were celebrating the sacrament and basically getting together and having fellowship on Saturdays? And yet now the beast suddenly in 400s immediately starts changing its tune. This shape is to be observed every week so that the memory of this day will be forever celebrated. If some think that they should fast only once and that this be on Saturday alone, then the celebration of Sunday and of Friday will happen only at Easter. Yet in the memory of Sunday and of Friday if the memory of Sunday and Friday are to be restored for each week, then they are crazy who observe the customs of those 2 days but overlook Saturday, whose purpose is no different from what happens on those 2 days. For Friday is observed because it was on this day that the Lord suffered and went on to the dead world, so that rising on the 3rd day he might restore the joy after the 2 days of sadness. We do not then deny that Friday should be a day of fasting, but we add that Saturday should be so also. For it is evident that on both days sadness overshadowed the apostles and that those who had followed Christ. Those who rejoice on the Lord's Day want not only that it be very festive, but it be observed more frequently, which is every week. So you start to see the fangs coming out in profaning the Sabbath and making you want to find rest, salvation, festivity, all that goodness in Sunday. Sunday sacredness starting to come through. Now the next thing I want to show you is Theodosius II, and he prohibits public spectacles on Sunday. This happened in 425. Emperor Theodosius basically continued the track of his previous Roman pontifexes and added to the sin by making more and more restrictions on Sunday so that it becomes more and more a day of sacredness and rest. And now we're dealing with emperors that are Christian emperors, quote unquote. This is after Constantine. And yet they are enforcing the rules of the pagan pontifex. Remember, again, the rule in the 321 AD that Constantine passed was a pagan law. So he spoke from his office as pontifex of the Babylonian system. Because remember that pontifex was carried over from Babylon and eventually Nimrod. So when he established the sacredness of Sunday as a day to rest on, he was speaking in the authority of the man of sin really throughout all time, which is continued in the little horn power and everything else, the Antichrist. And of course, each one of these Roman princes afterward only continued it. And when the popes came in place, they only continued it in this way because Satan rules that institution. He gave his throne and power and great authority to the beast. So we're going to look on Codex Theodosianus 15.5.5. This is the website with it where the transcriptions are. And it's called De Spectaculis, of spectacles. Now, we're going to take all this Latin text, which is nicely transcribed for us, so we don't have to squint, and we're going to go in Google Translate, and we're going to translate it. It says, on Sunday, which is the first day of the whole week, and on the birthday and the Epiphany of Christ, and also on the 50th day of Easter, as long as the heavenly light of the laver, imitating the new light of the holy baptism, bears witness to the garments, imitating the new light of holy baptism, at which time the commemoration of the apostolic passion of the teacher of all Christianity is rightly celebrated by all the pleasures of the theaters and circuses are denied to the peoples of all cities, and the minds of all Christians and faithful are occupied with the worship of God. The beast is regulating what your mind needs to be doing. If any are still held back either by the madness of Jewish impiety or by the foolish error and madness of paganism, let them know that there is one time for supplications, another for pleasures. And lest anyone think he is compelled to honor our divinity by some great necessity of imperial duty, and that unless he despises divine religion and makes an effort to make spectacles, he may perhaps incur an offense against our serenity if he shows less devotion to us than he used to. Let no one doubt that then the greatest favor is bestowed upon our meekness by the human race, and the obedience of the world is paid to the virtues of Almighty God and the merits of the universe. If you do not do this, you are disobeying the will of God for your life. So that's where we are now in the early 400s. Next thing I want to show you is from John Cassian, Institutes, Book 3. And this is chapter 2 and chapter 9. John Cassian was a Christian monk, an ascetic, a theologian, very popular for the 4th century and early 5th century, and he wrote lots of books. And so this is some things we're going to be looking at. So chapter 2 in Institutes, Book 3, says, how among the Egyptians they apply themselves all day long to prayer and psalm continually with the addition of work without distinction of hours. For among them, the Egyptians, these offices which are taught to render the Lord at separate hours and at intervals of time, with a reminder from the convener, are celebrated continuously throughout the whole day, with the addition of work and that of their own free will. For manual labor is incessantly practiced by them in their cells in such a way that meditation on the Psalms and the rest of the Scriptures is never entirely omitted. And as with it at every moment they mingle suffrages and prayers, they spend the whole day in those offices with which we celebrate at fixed times. Wherefore, except vespers and nocturnes, there are no public services among them in the day except on Saturday and Sunday, when they meet together at the 3rd hour for the purpose of Holy Communion. For that which is continuously offered is more than what is rendered at interval times, and more acceptable as a free gift than the duties which are performed by the compulsion of a rule, as David for this rejoices somewhat exultingly when he says, freely will I sacrifice unto you, and let the free will offerings of my mouth be pleasing to you, O Lord. So what is this document? That the Egyptians were keeping both Saturday and Sunday for Holy Communion and getting together and everything else. Is that in alignment with the Pontifex Innocent, who says, Saturday is not, church tradition says that Saturday is not a day to be doing these things. We have to fast on Saturday. Is that in alignment? No, it's not. So it shows you that Rome did not have control over the entire church, and everybody was still doing certain things differently. Very important. So we're now into the 400s. Actually, wait, I forgot to read chapter 9 of the same book. So let's go back to chapter 9. Here it is. And it kept my highlights. Gosh, that's such a refreshing thing. Okay, chapter 9. The reason why a vigil is appointed as the Sabbath day dawns, and why a dispensation from fasting is enjoyed on the Sabbath all throughout the East. So now we're dealing with the East, and they don't have to fast on Saturday. Let's see. And throughout the whole of the East, it has been settled ever since the time of the preaching of the apostles, when the Christian faith and religion was founded, that these vigils should be celebrated as the Sabbath dawns. For this reason, because when our Lord and Savior has been crucified on the 6th day of the week, the disciples, overwhelmed by the freshness of his sufferings, remained watching throughout the whole night, giving no rest or sleep to their eyes. Wherefore, since that time, a service of vigils has been appointed for this night, and is still observed in the same way up to the present day all throughout the East. And so after the exertion of the vigil, a dispensation from fasting appointed in the like manner for the Sabbath by apostolic men is not without reason enjoined in all the churches of the East, in accordance with the saying of Ecclesiastes, which, although it has another and a mystical sense, is not misapplied to this, by which we are charged to give to both days, that is, to the 7th and 8th, equally the same share of the service, as it says, give a portion to these 7 and also to these 8. Ecclesiastes 11, verse 2. For this dispensation from fasting must not be understood as a participation in the Jewish festival by those above all who are shown to be free from all Jewish superstitions, but as contributing to that rest of the wearied body for which we have spoken, which as it fasts continually for 5 days in the week, all throughout the year, would easily be worn out and fail unless it were revived by an interval of at least 2 days. So John Cassian is telling you that in the East, they see it fit not to fast on Saturday because Saturday is supposed to refresh you and revive you from all the fasting you're doing during the week. And it should be a day where you're getting together for prayers and festivities and keeping it holy. So we are now into the 400s. Consistently, you see that Christians were keeping both days as significant, especially if you were in the East. Saturday was the day of the Sabbath. It was a day of rest and recovery from the week, a day of joy, a day of worship and having communion with other believers. And so was Sunday. Sunday was a day of worship, of liturgies, of fellowship, and so on. Some did prayer and liturgy on both days. Some, basically just had festivities on Saturday. There's no consistent thing, but people were keeping Sabbath holy. The point is that it was honored for centuries, many centuries, even after Constantine's edict. We are now 100 years after Constantine's Sunday law. And people were still doing these things. Now, you also see the issue of fasting on the Sabbath being continued and propagated by Rome during this time, obviously, using traditions and conjectures that don't exist, smoke and mirrors. Oh, Peter fasted on the Sabbath before meeting Simon Magus, or you have to be miserable because church tradition says that Jesus was resting in the tomb, which is true. He was resting in the tomb on the Sabbath. But church tradition is that, you have to be miserable during this time. Tradition and words of men and oral tradition and conjectures to justify these situations rather than Scripture, which, of course, there's no scriptural basis for keeping a fast on the Sabbath. The next resource I want to show you is The Controversy Over Fasting on Saturday Between Constantinople and Rome by Radisa Antic. This is a paper that we looked at, we mentioned a little while ago, I believe, one of these previous sections, but this is a pretty thorough paper on this issue, and we're going to read it. It's going to recapitulate a lot of history from around 600 to 1000 AD or so, but it looks at 3 major events, and you'll see what they are in just a second, that are basically huge climaxes throughout this time from about 600 AD to about the 1054 Schism with this whole fasting issue. And this paper was published at Andrews University Seminary in volume 49 in number 2 in 2011. So let's take a read. The question of fasting on Saturday was a significant point of theological debate between the Eastern and Western churches during the first millennium of Christian history. This issue is closely related to the fact that the Christian church during the first several centuries after Christ celebrated both Saturday and Sunday as weekly days of worship. For example, a church historian of the 5th century, Socrates Scholasticus of Constantinople, noted that, quote, "For although almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week, yet the Christians of Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this." I wonder what ancient tradition that would be. The Apostolic Constitutions, compiled in the 4th century, probably in Antioch, states similarly that Christians should keep the Sabbath and the Lord's Day festivals, because the former is the memorial of the creation and the latter of the resurrection. It thus seems logical to assume, on the basis of these and other statements, that with the exception of Rome and Alexandria, throughout the Christian world, there were worship services on both Saturday and Sunday as late as the 5th century, which is the 400s, but it's even more than that, with the Western Church appearing to emphasize the importance of Sunday as the weekly day of worship. On the other hand, the Eastern Church seemed to be torn by its desire to remain in harmony with its understanding about apostolic tradition and its need to keep good relations with Rome. So there was a dialectic there with the East. The East was not wanting to let go of the traditions of the apostles that were brought, but they also had a lot of increasing conflict with Rome as the little horn was coming up and asserting its power and saying, no, we have divine right to rule. You need to do it like us, and so on. Moving on. The Eastern-Western conflict over the day of worship is related to the question of fasting on the Sabbath. These conflicts are especially evident in 3 historical events: the fifth to sixth ecumenical council held in Trullo in 691, the ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the Bulgarian Church, and the Great Schism of 1054. The purpose of this paper is to describe and critically assess the canons of the Council of Trullo, and regarding the Saturday fasting controversy, the encyclical of Patriarch Photius, connected to the status of the Bulgarian Church, and the documents associated with the Great Schism. This analysis attempts to explain why the matter of fasting on Saturday played such a central role in disagreements between the Eastern and Western Church communities. The 5th, 6th Ecumenical Council in Trullo. The council in Trullo, called by Emperor Justinian II in 691, met in an imperial banqueting hall in Trulum at Constantinople. The purpose of this council, also known as the 5th, 6th Council, was to complete the work of the 5th and 6th Ecumenical Councils. The 5th was in 553 AD and the 6th was in 681. In the absence of the emperor, the council was presided over by Paul III, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, and attended by patriarchs Petros III of Alexandria, Georgios II of Antioch, Anastasios II of Jerusalem, and as well as 211 bishops. There are disagreements among scholars as to whether the Western Church was officially represented at this council. Historians and theologians of the Western Church claim that Rome was not represented. And evidence of that claim is found in Pope Sergius III's rejection of certain canons of the council, particularly those statements giving the Patriarch of Constantinople equal status with the Roman Pope. However, historians of the Eastern Church point out that the Pope of Rome was represented through the delegation of bishops from Eastern Illyricum. In addition to these Western representatives, there were 4 bishops from Crete: Basilios of Gortyna, Nikitas of Kydonia, Sisinos of Chersonesos, and Theopemptos. Basilios of Gortyna signed the canons of the Synod in the following way. Quote, Basilios Episcopus Gortynae Metropolis Christum Amantis Gretae Insulae, and so on and so forth. Basilios, Bishop of Gortyna, Metropolis of the Lord, loving island of Crete, and the whole Synod of the Holy Church of Rome. So there's evidence that Rome did have representation, so Rome's arguments, as usual, are refuted. Nevertheless, in spite of this evidence, the question of whether Rome was officially represented at the Council of Trullo will probably remain a point of debate between the Western and Eastern churches. I think it was probably represented, but they are going to argue otherwise for their own agenda. However, what is of interest for this work is that out of 102 canons issued by the 5th, 6th Council, the 29th canon, the 52nd, the 55th, the 56th, and 89th refer to the issue of fasting in general as well as to fasting on Saturday. Why was so much space dedicated to the problem of fasting, particularly to fasting on Saturday? What is the historical background of this controversy? From apostolic times, Christians have practiced fasting. Most early Christians of Jewish background apparently followed the Jewish custom of fasting and prayer on Mondays and Thursdays. However, contrary to that Jewish practice, at least some in the Christian church near the end of the 1st century adopted Wednesdays and Fridays as the days of fasting. Remember the Didache and the whole issue there? The Didache was written in, I think, a little bit after the year 100, but that was already happening. Furthermore, by the end of the 5th century, the Latin Church replaced Wednesday with Saturday as a fasting day, probably in opposition to the Jews and to the Christians of Jewish background or leanings who were reluctant to change their practice of fasting on certain days. Nevertheless, in the Eastern churches, it was a general rule that there should be no fasting on Saturday, and specifically that Saturday as well as Sunday should be exempt from fasting in the period before Easter. The council in Trullo strongly reacted against these changes made by Rome, claiming that by introducing Saturday as the day of fasting, the Roman Church acted against the apostolic tradition clearly expressed in the apostolic constitutions, and that should be followed by all Christians. What follows is a short review of the key points mentioned in Canons 29, 52, 55, 56, and 89 of the Council of Trullo concerning the controversy of fasting in general and particularly on Saturday. Now, the Apostolic Constitution, just really quick, that's not something that the apostles wrote, just so you know. That's just a collation of documents and teachings that the Eastern Church was holding on to as genuine tradition from the apostles, but these things were not written down by the apostles, just so you're aware of that also. Let's see. This is... Okay, so I think we have to keep going. Was there? Yes, Canon 55. Since we understand that in the city of Romans, in the holy fast of Lent, they fast on Saturdays, contrary to the ecclesiastical observance, which is traditional, It seems good to the Holy Synod that also in the Church of the Romans the canon shall immovably stand fast, which says, if any cleric shall be found to fast on a Sunday or Saturday, except on one occasion only, he is to be deposed, and if he is a layman, he shall be cut off. Pretty strong words by the East against the West. In this canon, the fathers of the Council in Trullo reacted against the non-canonical practice of fasting by the Church in Rome on Saturdays and on Sundays during Lent. At the end of the Apostolic Constitutions, Ecclesiastical Canon number 64 states the following: if any one of the clergy be found in the fast day on the Sabbath day, except one only, let him be deprived. But if he is one of the laity, let him be suspended. On the basis of this statement, the Eastern Church adopted as a general rule that there should be no fasting on the Sabbath, and that Sabbath and Sunday should be excluded from the period of fasting before Lent. The one exception in the whole liturgical year was the Sabbath, which is that of the Lord's burial. For inasmuch as the Creator was then under the earth, the sorrow for him is more forcible than the joy of creation. So the Sabbath before Easter Sunday was the one that they were saying, okay, that one, maybe it's allowed to fast on that day, but every other Sabbath, you don't be fasting. Contrary to the position of the Eastern Church in the Apostolic Constitutions, the Western Church, in opposition to the Jews and Judaists, Christians of Jewish background or leanings, adopted the practice of observing Saturday as a day of fasting. However, Augustine, Ambrose of Milan, and Jerome claimed that this matter had not been decided by divine authority and that there was no particular connection with the essence of faith and of sanctification. Boy, that didn't ring well for Roman ears, does it? They believed that in such matters each individual should follow the custom of his own church or the country in which he resided and strive that the bond of charity might not be broken by differences in such unimportant matters. Augustine writes that, quote, God did not lay down a rule concerning fasting or eating on the seventh day of the week, either at the time of his hallowing that day, because in it he rested from his works, or afterwards when he gave precepts to the Hebrew nation concerning the observance of that day. Thus, he emphasizes that neither the Holy Scriptures nor the universal tradition of the Church says anything decisive on this point, and that only weak minds insist on the practice being the only right one. In spite of Augustine's position, however, which seems to express a great dose of religious liberty in the domain of unessential matters, the historical evidence shows something different. Namely, that the Roman Church from a very early period required uniformity in things unessential. You must obey this authority more and more and more. The Roman Church unmistakably claimed that this custom of fasting on the Sabbath came down from Peter, the first of the apostles, and hence ought to be universally observed. Where does it say that in the Bible? Does it say anything about Peter fasting on the Sabbath and that you need to do that to emulate him? Further, at the same time that Augustine voiced his opinion about fasting, the Roman bishop Innocent issued a declaration to the Spanish bishop Decentius, which we looked at, that the Sabbath, like Friday, must be observed as a fast day. In opposition to the entire ecclesiastical tradition expressed in the Apostolic Constitutions, that the Sabbath is the commemoration of the joy of creation, Innocent argued that the Sabbath necessarily belongs to the period of sorrow because after Jesus' crucifixion, the apostles were plunged into grief and hid themselves due to fear, and the Sabbath precedes Sunday, the joyful day of the resurrection. The controversy over fasting on Sabbath unmistakably shows that the displacement of Saturday by Sunday as the day of the weekly Christian worship and rest was a long and slow process. The evidence from the 5th century indicates that also that at the time both Sabbath and Sunday were observed generally throughout the Christian world, except in Rome and Alexandria. Milas writes the following: Christians celebrated Sunday, the day on which Christ was resurrected from death and through this accomplished his work of redemption. This day for Christians was a day of joy and brotherly meetings in Christ, as well as the day of repentance for committed sins. Almost the same meaning was attributed to the Sabbath. Christians consider the Sabbath too as a day of joy and remembrance of the day of creation of the world and the rest of God. On the Sabbath in the Eastern Church, assemblies were held, sermons preached, and communions were celebrated. 2 canons issued by the Synod of Laodicea and Phrygia in 360 mention the Sabbath and some of the activities that the Christians should practice on the Sabbath. We looked at this council and the canons specifically. Canon 16 states that on Saturday the Gospels and other portions of the Scripture shall be read aloud. That means they were keeping the Sabbath as a day of worship and communion. However, in apparently sharp contradiction, Canon 29 of the same Synod proposes that Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on the Saturday, but shall work on that day. But the Lord's day they shall especially honor in every way possible as Christians. If, however, they are found Judaizing, they shall be shut out from Christ. While this is a statement against the practice of Judaizing, however, Western Christianity was not yet ready to acknowledge fully that the real origin of the change of the day of fasting was in opposition to the Jewish communities, asserting instead that Peter established a fast on the Sabbath in preparation for the dispute with Simon Magus. What is clear, however, is that Canon 29 of the Synod of Laodicea demonstrates that, first, there were Christians resting on the Sabbath day in the second part of the 4th century, and who were doing so in recognition of the Creator's own rest on the Sabbath at the end of Creation Week. Second, August Neander rightly states that, quote, in many districts, a punctual Jewish observance of the Sabbath must doubtless have been very common. Hence, the Council of Laodicea considered it necessary to order that Christians should not celebrate this day after the Jewish manner, nor consider themselves bound to abstain from labor. Yeah, again, if they weren't keeping the Sabbath, why is the Council of Laodicea telling people not to Judaize? Simple math. Zeger Bernard van Espen also writes that, quote, among the Greeks, the Sabbath was kept exactly as the Lord's day, except so far as the cessation of work was concerned. Therefore, the controversy over the fasting on the Sabbath, which was the point of debate at the Council of Trullo, is only the byproduct of the deep conviction of the Christian Church in the East during the first centuries of the Christian era that the Sabbath is the day of rest established by God at the time of the creation of the world. In addition to the evidence of Canon 29, 3 key statements from the Apostolic Constitutions reinforce the statements of Canon 55 concerning the Sabbath. Again, remember that the Apostolic Constitutions are not written by the apostles. They're a collection of texts, kind of like the Didache, kind of like that. And they were held in higher esteem by the Eastern Church. And they had a lot of things to say about the Sabbath, so this is some of them. Number 1, in the Apostolic Constitutions 2.59, the Sabbath is declared along with Sunday to be the day that the Church assembles. Quote, but assemble yourself together every day, morning and evening, singing psalms and praying in the Lord's house. In the morning saying the 62nd psalm, and in the evening the 140th, but principally on the Sabbath day. And of the day of our Lord's resurrection, which is the Lord's day, meet more diligently, sending praise to God that made the universe by Jesus and sent him to us, and condescended to let him suffer and raised him from the dead. Otherwise, what apology will he make to God who does not assemble on that day, or to hear the saving word concerning resurrection? So both days were honored. Number 2, the Apostolic Constitution states that on the Sabbath and on Sunday the slaves should rest from their labors and attend church with the rest of the Christians to listen to the preaching from the Holy Scriptures. Quote, let the slaves work 5 days, but on the Sabbath day and the Lord's day let them have leisure to go to the church for instruction and piety. We have said that the Sabbath is on account of the creation and the Lord's day of the resurrection. Number 3, the Apostolic Constitutions declare that there should be no fasting on the Sabbath, except for the Sabbath during which Jesus lay resting in the tomb, given that Sabbath reminds one of the joy and delight of the creation of the world. If someone refuses to follow this decree, he should be excluded from the fellowship of the church. Canon 56. We have likewise learned that in the regions of Armenia and in other places certain people eat eggs and cheese on the Sabbaths and Lord's days of the Holy Lent. It seems good, therefore, that the whole Church of God, which is in all the world, should follow one rule and keep the fast perfectly, and as they abstain from everything which is killed, so also they should from eggs and cheese, which are the fruit and produce of those animals from which we abstain. But if any shall not observe this law, if they be clerics, let them be deposed, but if laymen, let them be cut off. This canon demonstrates that the Christians in the East, although they did not fast on Sabbath and on Sundays of Lent, did, however, abstain from everything which is killed, from eggs and cheese, which are the fruit and produce of those animals, from which they refrained during the fasting days. In writing this stipulation, the fathers of the council in Trullo emphasized they emphasized the need to remain faithful to Canon 69 of the Apostolic Constitutions, which states the following: if any bishop or presbyter or deacon or reader or singer does not fast the fast of 40 days or the 4th day of the week, and the day of preparation, let him be deprived, except be hindered by the weakness of the body. But if he be one of the laity, let him be suspended. So you start seeing a mixing with truth and error again, even in the East. It's not like the East had it perfect. They were already starting to do traditions with fasting in 40 days, and you got to do this, and you can abstain from cheese, but you can't do this or whatever else. But they do have the day of preparation, which you don't have that kind of language unless you honored the Sabbath and you were preparing for the Sabbath. So that's important. It is necessary, according to Canon 56, that the whole universal Church of God fast in the manner already established as it is expressed in the apostolic constitutions. This warning is especially directed towards the Church of Armenia and in other places, probably having in mind primarily the Church in Rome. In Canon 56, one can easily detect the urgency of the Fathers of the Council in Trullo to remain faithful to the teachings of the apostles, to the earlier original traditions, and to what ultimately leads to the teachings of the early Church and Christ himself. As with the other canons, this canon also expresses the strong intent for the Council of Trullo to have some special regulations for Sabbath and Sunday. Canon 89. The faithful, spending the days of the salutary passion in fasting, praying, and compunction of heart, ought to fast until the midnight of the great Sabbath, since the divine evangelists Matthew and Luke have shown us how late at night it was that the resurrection took place, the one by using the words something in Greek and the other something in Greek. As we have stated earlier, there was only one Sabbath during the year when, according to the Council of Trullo, the faithful should fast, the great Sabbath of Lent. The Apostolic Constitutions 7.23 describe this as the Sabbath of our Lord's burial, on which men ought to keep the fast, but not a festival. For inasmuch as the Creator was then under the earth, the sorrow for him is much more forcible than the joy for the creation. Canon 89 stipulates that the fast on the great Sabbath should end about the middle of the Holy Saturday night, since the divine evangelists Matthew and Luke have shown us how late at night the resurrection took place. At the hour of the Lord's resurrection, after the days of fasting, contrition, and humbling of the soul, the faithful should cease fasting and begin to rejoice. Regardless of one's position regarding the theology of fasting, one can appreciate the preoccupation of the Fathers of the Council of Trullo to remain in harmony with the teachings of the apostolic tradition and to maintain an ecclesiastical unity in the observance of fasting. Moreover, it is clear that for them the Sabbath day as well as Sunday had to be set apart, not just as a special day of non-fasting, but also as a day of worship on which the faithful should experience the joy of the creation and the resurrection of Jesus. The controversy concerning the Church in Bulgaria. Long before the controversy concerning who would have the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Church of Bulgaria in the 9th century, there were numerous quarrels between Eastern and Western Christianity. In 856, Theodora, Empress of the Byzantine Empire, retired from the court, and her underage son, Michael III, was appointed to succeed her under the protection of her brother, Bardas. However, Bardas and young Michael III allowed corruption and immorality to rule the court. In response, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Ignatius, refused communion to the young king, an act which infuriated Bardas and Michael. They removed Ignatius from his position and exiled him. Ignatius was succeeded by Photius, a layman who was considered to be, quote, the most learned scholar in the world, the highly gifted man, distinguished as a philosopher in a generation and displaying as a theologian qualities which bespeak genius. When news of the succession reached Pope Nicholas I, he sent 2 legates to investigate. When the legates arrived in Constantinople, they accepted gifts from Bardas' supporters, and at the trial of Ignatius, they took the side of Bardas. Thus, Ignatius' removal was confirmed. However, in 862, Nicholas I re-examined the controversy and came to the conclusion that Ignatius was wrongly deposed. Because of this, he threatened Photius with excommunication, thereby further straining the relationship between Rome and Constantinople over the question of ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Church in Bulgaria. The Bulgarians had been Christianized by missionaries from Constantinople and had received priests from the Eastern Church. The Bulgarian king Boris had been baptized by Greek priests. However, Boris, upon further thought, decided that an ecclesiastical dependence on Constantinople might put the political independence of Bulgaria in danger. Therefore, he wrote to Rome, asking what has come to be called the 105 religious quotations, and requesting that the Pope to send bishops to put the church in Bulgaria in order. Nicholas I honored Bogoris' request, sending bishops who introduced the Latin form of worship and declared the church in Bulgaria to be the daughter of Rome. Kind of reminds me when the Israelites made a pact with Egypt against God's recommendations and warnings. As a result, the Greek priests were humiliated and sent into exile to Constantinople. Distrust and aversion were transformed into open hostility. In 867, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, wrote an encyclical to other patriarchs of the Eastern churches, accusing the Church of Rome of banditry and robbery of the church in Bulgaria, as well as accusing them of other abuses. The 5 abuses of Rome mentioned in this encyclical are, take note of these 5 of abuses that are complaints of the Eastern churches against the Western Church. Number 1, observing Saturday as a fast day. Number 2, giving permission to the people to eat flesh food and animal products during the first week of Easter. Despising the priests from the East who live in a lawful marriage while their priests live in adultery and concubinage. Yeah, because they were forbidding marriage, and yet the priests were terribly corrupt, even though... And so the West was accusing the East of, basically allowing their priests to marry, when the West's, celibacy and all the monasticism that came from Augustine was full of corruption and adultery and all sorts of crazy things, as usual. Number 4, declining to give consent to the priests and bishops to conduct the sacrament of confirmation, teaching that the Holy Spirit proceeds not only from the Father, but adding the phrase, and the Son, filioque. That's another controversy, which was the whole filioque thing. I talk about that in my Trinity series. The Orthodox are wrong on that, just so you know. The encyclical, which is sometimes called the Magna Carta of the Eastern Orthodoxy, expresses a forceful declaration of Constantinople's independence from Rome and finishes with the statement of dethronement and excommunication of Pope Nicholas I. At least during this short period of time, it seemed that Photius won in his criticism of Rome because of the logic of his argument and the support he had from the clergy and the people. Well, we know that Rome's going to win because Rome is the seat of the devil. It is significant for the Saturday-Sunday debate that at this critical point in the history of the relationship between the eastern and western parts of Christianity, the first point of disagreement mentioned in this encyclical is fasting on the Sabbath. Now, we're in the 800s now, okay? So just a reminder. It is also interesting to note that in this document, Sunday is not mentioned as the non-fasting day. Of course, there were other issues behind this encyclical, such as the power struggle between the two segments of Christianity and aspirations to control certain territories. Nevertheless, the problem of fasting on Sabbath not only remained on the agenda, but was still the item on the agenda of disagreements in the 9th century. This first excommunication, in which Pope Nicholas I was also dethroned in 867, would find its echo from the Latin side in the 11th century. Was fasting on the Sabbath still an issue in the later controversy between the two Christian churches? Let's find out. Fasting on the Sabbath and the Great Schism of 1054. In 1042, Constantine Monomachos was inaugurated as the new king of the Byzantine Empire. 1 year later, Michael Cerularius became patriarch of the Eastern Church. These two men would become the central protagonists in defending the interests of the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Great Schism of 1054. Michael Cerularius was the real ruler not only of the church but also of the state, since soon after Constantine Monomachos became emperor, he suffered from paralysis and became a mere figurehead. In Rome, Pope Leo IX believed that he inherited absolute power over all Christian people and institutions from Peter himself. We document that quite a bit in my Pope series. It seems that the Great Schism began with a letter written by Metropolitan Archbishop Leo of Acrita and Michael Cerularius to Bishop John of the Church of Trani in southern Italy. However, the letter was intended not only for Bishop John, but also through him to all the chief priests and the priests of the Franks, and the monks and the peoples, and to the most reverend Pope himself. This open letter singles out two distinctive abuses of the Western Church. It made a special attack on the practice of the Roman Church of making the Sabbath a fast day. We're now in the year 1000 plus. And the use of the unleavened bread for the Eucharist. It is interesting to notice that what was apparently the most controversial issue, that of the filioque, is not even mentioned in this letter. Around the same time, another learned theologian from the East, Nicetas Stethatos, wrote a booklet titled Libellus contra Latinos, in which he accused the Roman Church of breaking the rules of the constitutions of the Holy Apostles against fasting on the Sabbath, as well as of being disobedient to the scriptures and the canons of other church councils, which had forbidden this practice. To these two accusing documents from the East came two replies from the Western side. Pope Leo IX wrote in Apologia for the Roman Church to Michael Cerularius and Leo of Acrita, claiming that he was the successor of the Apostle Peter and that he was invested with supreme authority over the universal church and that his word was law for the faithful to obey. A second defense supporting Pope Leo IX came from Cardinal Humbert, who wrote his Responsio to Nicetas Stethatos. Moreover, Pope Leo IX decided early in 1054 to send a group of theologians to Constantinople to discuss further the contended issues. This group consisted of 3 papal legates: Cardinal Humbert, Frederick, deacon and chancellor of the Church of Rome, and Peter, archbishop of Amalfi. Upon their arrival, the papal legates discussed the issues with the patriarch, the emperor, and publicly with Nicetas Sthethatos in the presence of the emperor, his court, and other persons of high ranking in affairs of the state and church. Patriarch Michael Cerularius was offended by the letter brought to him by the legates and responded to the accusations concerning the Sabbath observance by saying the following: "For we are commanded also to honor the Sabbath equally with Sunday, the Lord's Day, and to keep it not to work on it." This is now, we're talking 1054 AD, 1,000 years after the Gospels. And the Patriarch of Constantinople is saying we are commanded to not work on Saturday, standing up for the Sabbath. Bet you didn't know that if you were Orthodox. After these unsuccessful discussions and other attempts to bring the Eastern Church into submission to the Church of Rome, there occurred one of the most dramatic and most devastating events in the history of Christianity. On July 16, 1054, the Sabbath day, when preparations had been made for the liturgy on that day, 3 papal legates entered the Church of St. Sophia and laid the bull of excommunication on the altar and walked away. So interesting that it happened on the Sabbath. Toward Rome, shaking the dust from their feet. From that day on, the fracture between Constantinople and Rome has never been healed, and the Church of Rome has considered Eastern Orthodox Christendom as excommunicated and heretical. In his work Adversus Columnas Graecorum, against the calumnies of the Greeks, Cardinal Humbert, remember he's a Roman, wrote the following: "Therefore, in such observance of the Sabbath, where and in what way do we Latins have anything in common with the Jews? For they are idle and keep a holiday on the Sabbath, neither plowing nor reaping, and by reason of custom do not work, but they hold a festivity and a dinner, and their manservants and maidservants and cattle and beasts of burden rest. But we Latins observe none of these things, but we do every sort of work, as we do on the preceding 5 days, and we fast as we are wont to fast on the 6th day, Friday next to it. So we are blaspheming this day as much as we can. However, you Greeks, if you do not Judaize, tell us, why do you have something in common with the Jews with the similar observance of the Sabbath?" Get ready for these arguments to happen pretty soon again. "They certainly observe the Sabbath, and you observe it. They dine and always break the fast on the Sabbath. In their 40-day period, they break the fast every Sabbath except one. And you Greeks, in your 40-day period, break the fast every Sabbath except one. They, the Jews, have a twofold reason for observing the Sabbath, obviously by reason of the precept of Moses, and because the disciples were saddened and heavy of heart on this Sabbath day on account of the death of the Lord, whom they did not believe to be about to be resurrected. Wherefore, because you observe the Sabbath of the Jews, and with us Sunday, the Lord's Day, you appear by such observance to imitate the sect of the Nazarenes, who in this manner accept the Christianity that they might not give up Judaism. But the Latin Church, in compassionate regard for the Lord and his suffering and death, rejoice in his resurrection on Sunday, the Lord's Day, when concern much troubled the Jews as they were seeking to corrupt the guards of the sepulchre by means of money. Wherefore we Latins holding on to the present time the apostolic tradition concerning the Sabbath, and desiring to hold it." Now notice how they're appealing to apostolic tradition too. The apostles did not tell anybody to fast on the Sabbath. "And desiring to hold it unto the end, are careful to subscribe to that which our ancient and venerable fathers declared and confirmed, among whom the most blessed Pope Sylvester," this is now 700 years previous to this, "the spiritual father of the Emperor Constantine the Great, said among other things, quote, if every Sunday Lord's Day on account of the Lord's resurrection is to be kept in the joy of Christians, then every Sabbath day on account of the burial is to be estimated in execration of the Jews. For all the disciples of the Lord had a lamentation on the Sabbath, bewailing the buried Lord, and gladness prevailed for the exulting Jews. But for the fasting apostles sadness reigned. Let us Christians therefore be sad with the saddened on account of the burial of the Lord, if we would rejoice with them on account of the resurrection of the Lord. For it is not proper that we should observe we should observe on account of Jewish custom, the subversion of the foods and ceremonies of the Jews." So Sylvester was definitely contra Judei. These and similar things have been said by St. Sylvester. The tradition of the Apostolic See did not please some of the Easterners, but they choose rather to observe the Sabbath with the Jews. You're not bowing down to our authority, Eastern Orthodox. And we have apostolic authority, and look, the apostles handed it down through Peter all the way to Pope Sylvester, and Pope decreed this in 300 whatever, and now we're telling you to do it, and you're not doing it. Cardinal Humbert argued that the Christians from the East celebrate the Sabbath in a similar way as the Jews do. Quote, why do you have something in common with the Jews in a similar observance of the Sabbath? They certainly observe the Sabbath, and you observe it also. He also states that the Jews, and by analogy the Christians from the East, quote, are idle and keep a holiday on the Sabbath, neither plowing nor reaping, and by the reason of custom do not work. Further, he explains the theological reasons why the Jews and Christians from the East observe the Sabbath. Observing the precepts of Moses most likely means the revelation given to humanity through the prophet Moses in the Pentateuch, and more specifically the Ten Commandments. And number 2, the fasting of the Orthodox Church on only one Sabbath during the year, the day when Christ was in the tomb and the disciples were saddened and heavy of heart, on account of the death of the Lord. Cardinal Humbert concludes that since the Christians from the East observe the Sabbath with the Jews and the Lord's Day, Sunday, with the Latin Church, they must be designated as a sect. At least equally important, if not more so, is the response given by the Patriarch Cerularius, in which he states that Christians are commanded also to honor the Sabbath equally with Sunday as the Lord's Day, and to keep it and to not work on it. Consequently, Cerularius does not deny the accusations made by Humbert, but argues that Christians are commanded, probably meaning by biblical revelation in the apostolic tradition, to honor, worship, and not work on the Sabbath, even as on Sunday. Of course, the Bible doesn't command you to not work on Sunday, but you can see, even with this, there's truth being mixed with error. But nevertheless, we're in 1054, and the Patriarch of Constantinople is saying we are commanded to rest on the Sabbath, which means that they were upholding that. Well past, we're now 700 years after Constantine's Sunday law. Summary and conclusions. The dispute between Rome and Constantinople on the fasting on the Sabbath was one of the most controversial theological issues between the two segments of Christianity, lasting for more than 1,000 years. Although sometimes this theological quarrel is blurred with cultural and non-biblical elements, one cannot but appreciate the resolve of the fathers of the Council of Trullo, Patriarch Photius, Patriarch Cerularius, to remain faithful to the tradition of the apostles and the church fathers. 5 canons of the Synod of Trullo emphasize, in one way or another, the necessity of the Christian church to remain faithful to the truth about not fasting on the Sabbath as expressed in the apostolic constitutions. The Sabbath, along with Sunday, was a day when Christians should assemble, sing psalms, and pray in the house of the Lord. On the Sabbath, the slaves should rest from their labors and attend church and listen to the preaching from the Holy Scriptures with the rest of the Christians. Finally, there should be no fasting on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath reminds us of the joy and delight of the creation of the world. In dispute between the East and the West on the subject of the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Church of Bulgaria, Patriarch Photius, in his encyclical against Rome, mentioned in the first place that fasting on the Sabbath, that is, the decision of the Roman Church to reject and disregard the apostolic constitutions and to pronounce the Sabbath a day of fasting, it means that the struggle to understand the mystery of the Sabbath is still there in the 9th century. Very true. Finally, in the 11th century, after the Great Schism of 1054, Patriarch Cerularius made a tremendous statement that the Christians are commanded to honor the Sabbath and to keep it and to not work on it. Unfortunately, the Eastern Orthodox Church did not follow the words of Patriarch Michael Cerularius. In the centuries to follow, little by little, Eastern Orthodoxy distanced itself in its understanding of the Sabbath from the apostolic constitutions, from the fathers assembled at the Synod of Trullo, and from Patriarchs Photius and Cerularius, and came ever closer to the Church of Rome's understanding of the Sabbath. And pretty soon, my friends, they're going to be integrated. We'll see how it all plays out, but Eastern Orthodoxy is on a countdown timer like everything else. So, conclusion, my goodness, there's a lot to read, but I hope that you got a lot out of it, because history is very important to understand. Even from the 4th century until the Great Schism of 1054, Christians honored and kept the Sabbath. Because the devil gave his throne to Rome, it was the first to blaspheme the Sabbath and make it a burden and begin this tradition. But the Eastern Church and the Eastern areas kept the Sabbath and honored it for centuries. That's very clear. You'll see more evidence of that as we go on. With obviously this conflict over fasting and the letters of trying to control this issue, because this is one of the ways that Rome was trying to control people. Because remember, Rome is the seat of the devil, and the devil's job is to blaspheme God and disguise it as worshiping God. That is the mystery of iniquity. and the false gospel. And there's many threads to it. There's the Eucharist, there's all the doctrines, infant baptism, Immaculate Conception, so on, papal infallibility. There's a ton of them. One of those threads was fasting on the Sabbath. And Rome's job is to export the mystery religion, which is blasphemy of God disguised as worship of God, to the world. And in trying to flex that power and control and struggle, you see these revealing things between letters from these various people over time and seeing the intrigues and situations. And it shows you that the Roman Church was basically working its way into the world. The apostolic constitutions were a collection of writings and teachings. Again, they weren't written by the apostles. It's sort of like a Mishnah, like the Jews have their Mishnah. It's a commentary. It's basically a written document, a collation of written documents. And the Eastern Church decided to align with them, while of course the Western Church didn't, and they were very much pro-Sabbath, the apostolic constitutions. They were compiled over time from as early as the Didache in the 2nd century, in the 100s, and all the way through, I forget when it stopped being compiled, but it took a couple hundred years of compilation. And they were not authoritative like Scripture, but they were something that people were holding as authoritative, let's put it that way, as a guide for how to do Christianity. And of course, the big issue with that was keeping the Sabbath, fasting, and things like that. That really became an issue later. So, notice though, one thing with the Eastern Orthodox Church is that the compromise was still alive and well, even in the East. Even though the East was arguing for keeping the Sabbath and arguing for not fasting on the Sabbath and profaning it in that sense, they still honored both days and believed that you had to rest on Sunday, which made them susceptible to the delusion eventually because they compromised. Again, keeping Sunday as a day to get together and have fellowship is not wrong. It's not pagan. What is pagan is resting on Sunday, because that's a pagan practice initiated by a pagan, the pontifex. And that's the issue. And by having both days, they compromised to Rome's philosophy eventually. They also had a lot of traditions and things you can see with fasting and days and prayers, and you got to do this and you do that. Obviously, those things were very much developed by the year 1054, very different than the early church. And over time, these things got even worse over time and integrated more and more with Roman philosophy. Today, the Orthodox Church holds Sunday sacred. They don't keep the Sabbath. They don't have any of that. I don't think they fast on the Sabbath, but they don't keep the Sabbath holy. They don't command, anything on the Sabbath. Sunday is the Christian Sabbath for them, just like Catholics and just like Protestants. So a couple more synods and traditions that followed these things over time. These things developed, obviously, and the delusion and the sleight of hand that Satan accomplished in the 4th century began showing its teeth and enforcing its morality through physical compliance. After shaping the culture with Sunday as the special day, you had more and more councils and political changes and decrees and things like that to push people to stop working on Sunday and make it a day of rest, to enforce the inversion. Again, where Satan has his seat, that city exports the mystery religion, the mystery of iniquity, into the world with its teachings. Do it this way, not the way that God tells you to. And there's many threads to that. One of them is obviously doing the Sabbath and resting in a particular way. This is from Saint Network. And these are just documenting, it's an article documenting a few of these other councils. It says, later a number of councils and synods resumed the issue of Sabbatization. The Council of Orleans in 538, while protesting against excessive Sabbatarianism, banned any work in the field on Sunday. Subsequently, the Synod of Macon, 585, established that the day of the Lord is the day of perpetual rest, which is suggested to us by the type of the seventh day in the law and the prophets. So the seventh day is actually just a typology. It's really the first day of the week that typology was pointing to. Keep that in mind when we get to answering arguments at the end of this. And a complete cessation of all kinds of affairs is commanded, not just agricultural ones. How far the pro-Sunday tendency had gone by the end of the 6th century is shown by a letter of Gregory the Great, Pope between 590 and 604, which even forbade bathing on the first day of the week, often called the day of the resurrection of the Lord. Thus, Saturday was abandoned as a day of worship, and Sunday took over, at least partially, in the role of the Christian Sabbath. So you had more councils, more decrees, more things happening as time went on. This is now going backward in time because we went to the Great Schism. Now we're kind of recapitulating a little bit, and we're just going to keep layering and layering. The next thing I want to show you is a dictionary of Christian antiquities. Again, we looked at this before, but I want to go back to it and recapitulate some history to fill in some of the details. Augustine, from the 4th century, formed much of the theological basis for Catholicism, and between him and Constantine and Eusebius and all of these church, basically, authorities, Catholicism was created and birthed, the state religion of doing things your own way, or doing things, I should say, the devil's way. So his contribution, particularly to the narrative, is like others, like Chrysostom and Clement and Origen, to typify and spiritualize the Sabbath. We'll get back to this again. This is one of the main strategies of the devil. If you can be convinced that the Sabbath is actually typological and spiritual, then you can be convinced to reinterpret God's law. Do you get it? That's the point. That's the strategy. And typology is a beautiful thing that the Bible does. It's very, very awesome. I love studying typology. It's actually one of my favorite things to study. But typology can also be very, very dangerous because you can create something that isn't real and it's so seductive and, oh my gosh, it's so true. Look at this this is like this and that's like that. And pretty soon you are in apostasy and you are thinking that it's the will of God. And this is what the devil does. So he uses typology and over-spiritualization, which is Gnosticism, to show you patterns and, oh my gosh, look at this knowledge, this hidden meaning that you didn't see before. And it's so seductive, so awesome, and oh my gosh, and then pretty soon you're redefining and reinterpreting God's laws, and you are lawless. And you've taken the character of the beast upon you, which is the lawless character. So let's read in this particular dictionary, page 939 through 942 of PDF. Let's see. What do we got? Okay, I think we are in the yellow. All right. Let's see here. This is going to be kind of squinty, but anyway, St. Augustine's remarks on this matter may be taken as a fair type of the general teaching of the early church. He expressly distinguishes the fourth commandment from the rest as being observed figuratively or in an idea, not literally or an informal rule. So you can thank Augustine for that. For the Christian, he recognizes two kinds of sabbatical rest. First, a rest from the old works in his life. Next, an eternal rest in heaven, which according to the epistle to the Hebrews remaineth for the people of God. See Augustine, yada, yada, yada. But while the Jewish Sabbath could form no part of Christianity as such, yet, like other parts of the Mosaic law, it would endure in the actual practice of the Jewish Christians. In accordance with the apostolic principle, is any man called being circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised. And the apostolic practice of St. Paul in his own case, and in the case of Timothy, we can hardly doubt that in the earliest days of the church, the Christians, just as they were daily in the temple, so also kept the Sabbath with their Jewish brethren, while at the same time they broke the bread at home, and in this most solemn way as in others, kept the Lord's Day among their fellow Christians. So long as Jewish Christianity lasted as a distinct phase, coexisting rather than coincident with the Christianity of the Gentiles, it would indeed view the Sabbath obligation under the light of our Lord's teaching, in the spirit as distinguished from the letter, and with the limitations and mitigations which he assigned to it. In other words, the early church viewed the Sabbath as rightly as it should be viewed, which is a specific literal command. You see, the devil has to do the opposite of what God does. If God tells you something specific and literal and physical that you need to express in order to fulfill the commandment, the devil's saying, no, it's actually spiritual, so you can do whatever you want. You can do it like this. You can pick your own day. Jesus is your Sabbath. You can do it on the 8th day. You can do it whenever. This is the point. And the argument here is that the early Christians would have interpreted it literally and specifically because there's a specific prescription, because it is the prescription that identifies you to the lawgiver. When you rest on the 7th day in a sequence of 7 days, you are physically aligning to the pattern set down by God. And that's the point. Moving on. But still it would preserve substantially the old sabbatical observance, while at the same time the new and greater sacredness of the peculiarly Christian ordinance of the Lord's Day would, in the first instance, coexist with it, and afterwards, in all probability, throw it into the shade. That's exactly what happened. Now, after no long period of existence, Jewish Christianity as such gradually died out, especially after the fall of Jerusalem, destroying with the temple the system of Judaic observance, when even the church of the holy city itself became in great degree a Gentile church, and a growing antagonism established itself between Judaism and Christianity. Henceforth, so far as sabbatical observance retained its strict Judaic form and imposed itself as of universal obligation, it would be looked upon with suspicion. The Ebionites are spoken of by Eusebius as being half Jewish in observance of the Sabbath, while they were half Christian in observance of the Lord's Day. The Council of Laodicea anathematizes as Judaizers those who abstain from labor on the Sabbath, bidding them to honor rather the Lord's Day and, if possible, abstain from labor on it as Christians. The enactment is important not only in its attachment of the obligation of the rest to the Lord's Day, but as showing a form of antagonism to strict observance of the Sabbath as a day of rest, on the ground of its essentially Judaistic significance. Whatever the Sabbath was in the church, it was to be something wholly unlike this. Much in the same spirit of the Pseudo-Ignatius distinguishes between the Jewish and Christian idea of sabbatical observance. Let us not keep the Sabbath day after the Jewish manner, rejoicing in idleness, but spiritually rejoicing in the meditations of the law, not in the rest of the body, admiring the workmanship of God, and moreover infers that the keeping of the Sabbath was a preparation for the greater sacredness of the Lord's Day, the day of the resurrection, the royal festival, the highest of all days. Remember, Ignatius' letters were written in 250 AD. They weren't written by Ignatius, so it's an important point. By then, the dialectics had already been starting to bubble to the surface. But while the formal sabbatical obligation was thus repudiated as purely Judaistic, we find that in the Eastern Church a distinct observance of the Sabbath remained. And to remain so far in accordance with the old Jewish idea that with one notable exception, it was always a festal observance. This is brought out most strikingly in the apostolic constitutions, in which the Sabbath and the Lord's Day are treated almost as coordinate. Thus, Christians are exhorted on the Sabbath day and the day of the Lord's resurrection to gather together with special earnest, sending up praise to God who made all things by Jesus Christ and who sent him to us and delivered him to suffer and raised him from the dead. The different consecrations of the 2 days are still more clearly marked in verse 7:23, yada yada. Keep the Sabbath and Lord's Day as feasts, for one of the memorial of the creation, the other for the resurrection. We looked at these canons in the essay by Radisa Antic. In another one, 7:36, 1 and 2, there is an elaborate and beautiful prayer bringing out the sacredness of the Sabbath. Quote, O Almighty Lord, who didst create the world through Christ, and didst ordain the Sabbath as a memorial of creation, because in it thou didst rest from thy work. Thou, O Lord, didst bring our fathers out of Egypt, and didst give them the law of the Decalogue, spoken with thy voice and written with thy hand. Thou didst command them to keep the Sabbath, not giving in this an excuse for idleness, but an occasion for godliness. Did they hold the Sabbath with esteem? Absolutely. For the Sabbath is the rest from creation, completion of the world, the seeking out of the law, the praise of thanksgiving to God for all that he gave to men. The same passage goes on to speak also of the peculiar and yet higher consecration of the Lord's Day. In section 8, 33 verse 1, 33 and 1, we have a command in the names of the St. Peter and Paul. Let the servants work 5 days on the Sabbath, and the Lord's Day let them be free from labor in the church, with a view to the teachings of godliness. Whatever opinion we may form as to the genuineness and authority of these constitutions, on which the apostolic constitutions, it is at least clear that they represent a very considerable extent the traditions of the Eastern Church in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Thus, the very Council of Laodicea, so sternly condemnatory of Judaizing Sabbatarianism, yet in its 49th and 59th canon marks out the Sabbath day and the Lord's Day as days to be observed festily, even during the fast of Lent. So even the Council of Laodicea still, like I said, it wasn't universally there. It started with little things here and there, little pushes left and right. Everywhere the festal observance is very strikingly marked, and we note that the consecration of the Sabbath day by the rest of the Creator is brought home to Christians by a constant reference to the creation as having been wrought through Jesus Christ from a canon number 16 of the Council of Laodicea and from a passage in Socrates' ecclesiastical history. It appears that on the Sabbath as well as the Lord's Day there were solemn assemblies for worship. Gregory of Nyssa, upbraiding those who neglected the Sabbath assembly, asks, "With what face thou dare to behold the Lord's Day if thou hast despised the Sabbath? For they are sister days." We read that one also. Accordingly, in the Apostolical Canons, Canon 66, it is laid down that if any cleric be found fasting on the Lord's Day or the Sabbath except on Easter Eve alone, let him be deposed. If any laic, let him be excommunicated. The prohibition of this canon is illustrated by the extravagant declaration of Pseudo Ignatius that if anyone fasts on the Lord's Day or the Sabbath, he is a murderer of Christ. So Ignatius, in quotation marks, has certain things to say that people in Catholicism and Orthodoxy abuse to show that Sunday sacredness was always the case, but he also has things to say that do not support that case whatsoever. We may notice that this canon is appealed to in the Trullan or Quinnextine Council at the Constantinople in 685, in opposition to a custom at Rome of fasting on the Sabbaths in Lent, and it is decreed over the Roman Church also it should most firmly prevail. From a well-known passage in Epiphanius, we may conjecture that a special emphasis was given to the festal observance of the Sabbath by opposition to the heresy of Marcion, who is said to have bidden his followers fast on the Sabbath to signify their repudiation of the God of the Jews. But however this may be, it is clear that a reverence was paid in Eastern Church to the Sabbath festival, only second, though of course markedly second, to the higher sacredness of the Lord's Day. So they still had truth mixed with error, but this documents to you how the truth degraded over time in these people's minds. Nor was this festal observance confined to the Eastern Church. The practice of fasting on the Sabbath in the Rome Church is noticed by Tertullian and condemned on the ground that only on the great Sabbath should men fast. But he seems to indicate that the practice was not invariable and that it arose from a continuation of the Friday fast. The Montanists, he says, accepted both the Sabbath and the Lord's Day from their solemn fast weeks, in this respect distinctly following the ancient Eastern usage. In another place, speaking of the Lord's defense of his disciples for plucking and eating the ears of corn on the Sabbath, he declares that he remembered the privilege of exemption from fasting assigned to the Sabbath from the beginning. We looked at these quotes from Tertullian, alludes to the double gift of the manna on Friday to preserve the Sabbath from the necessity of fasting, and finally declares with characteristic vehemence that it should have destroyed the Sabbath, and even the Creator himself if he had commanded his disciples to fast against the declaration of the Scripture and the will of the Creator. It is true that he is throughout speaking of Jewish observance, but such language would hardly ever have been used without qualification had he not held strong opinions as to the continuance of this festal character of the Sabbath. Yeah, why would he be going through the trouble of defending all these things unless he had some high reverence for it, like most of the people in history up until 1000 plus? This conflict of usage continued long in the Western Church, for from the well-known epistle of St. Augustine to Cassulanus, we find that sabbatical fast was observed in his time only in the Church of Rome and a few other Western churches, the majority of Western churches in this point still agreeing with the East. Even at Milan, in the days of St. Ambrose, the Eastern usage prevailed, and when St. Augustine, at the request of his mother Monica, put the question of the method of observance of the day as a case of conscience to St. Ambrose, he treated it simply as a matter of the ordinance of this or that church, and added that while he never fasted on the Sabbath day in Milan, he did fast if he was at Rome. So entirely was the principle carried out that even in Africa in St. Augustine's time, some churches fasted on the Sabbath while others feasted. Let's see. Paris 13, for a similar statement on the variety of practices. So this is a citation of where that's found. Now, there's a little bit more. Okay. And this is under the section in the Dictionary of the Sabbath. It's page in the 1800s. Page 1823 to 1826. To this natural inference would be added also the effect of antagonism to Jewish observance as such. We find that both in the East and the West the Jewish Sabbath was thought of to be kept as a day of violent excess, from which was derived the common phrase of the luxus sabbatarius, and some think even the use of the word Sabbat for the unholy revelry of witches and evil spirits. Bingham, quotes passages to this effect from St. Chrysostom and St. Augustine and others. Chrysostom declares that the Jews used their release from secular work not for spiritual things, sobriety and modesty, and hearing the word of God, but in serving their bellies in drunkenness and gorging and revelry. Augustine similarly accuses the Jews of keeping the Sabbath with a mere bodily rest, lazy, dissolute, luxurious. Our rest, he adds, is for evil works. Theirs is for good works. It is better to plow than to dance. Many rest in the body and are turbulent in soul. That which is hymned in the psalm in the condition of the Christian, in the Sabbath of the heart, in the rest and the tranquility and the serenity of conscience. Really quick pause. Do you remember when I said that Satan baited the Jews either to the left or to the right? Either with legalism and in trying to keep all these Judaistic rules from the Old Covenant, or with gluttony and hypocrisy. So either way you cut it, the Christians observing these things, who were pagan and who didn't have an understanding of what Satan was actually doing because they're in the heat of the moment, they were very easily baited into hating the Jews and then saying, well, we don't want to be like you. What's the Christian identity different? Well, I guess the Sabbath is spiritual for us because we're resting from our works and you're hypocrites. You're not born again. So for us, it's different. So, and we're going to honor the Sunday as the expression of that. Such Sabbaths were, as Theodore and Cyril of Alexandria insist in commenting upon Amos 6, verse 3, the Sabbaton of the prophets, against which every Christian man should protest. What would be more natural than such a protest should be made by sobriety and mournfulness of a fast? We gather from the epistle of the St. Augustine to Cassulanus, quoted above, that in his days the Roman Church, with a characteristic imperiousness, like imperialness, and intolerance, urged the Sabbath fast in marked antagonism to all Jewish observance, as a matter of absolute obligation, insisting that they who neglect it are still in the flesh and cannot please God, lovers of their belly, preferring Judaism to the church and becoming children of the bondwoman. Remember when Augustine commented exactly on these issues and saying, hey, how can we call these people children of the flesh when they're genuine Christians? So this was very spicy at the time. If, says the champions of their cause, the Jew by keeping the Sabbath denies the Lord's day, how shall a Christian keep the Sabbath? Either let us be Christians and keep the Lord's day, or let us be Jews and keep the Sabbath. Augustine, indignantly rejecting his imperious intolerance and laying down the principle of the simple accordance on this matter to the custom of each church, has a curious passage on the great Sabbath and its effect on the general observance of the Sabbaths of the year. On that day, he says, the flesh of Christ rested in the grave, as God rested on that day from all the works of his creation. Hence arose that variety, that some, as especially the peoples of the East, on account of his rest, prefer to relax the fast. Others, like the Roman Church and some other churches of the West, on account of the humiliation of the death of the Lord and the grief of the disciples, prefer to fast. But looking at the question in the abstract, without recognizing any survival of the old Jewish feast, it would certainly seem that the Roman practice might be better supported in argument, and when its reasonableness was added, the effect of a strong anti-Judaic feeling. And the influence of the Roman Church, which was soon to become far greater, more imperious than in Augustine's time, it is not surprising that it should have prevailed over the more ancient practice. Not surprising, because the devil gave his throne and power and great authority to the beast, and he has been decreed to be successful with these things. At a later period, we find Gregory the Great laying it down with authority that to cause the Sabbath to be kept from work is a mark of Judaizing and a sign of the Antichrist. Ooh, keep that one in mind. The beast is saying that if you are going to keep the Sabbath, that is a mark. It's a mark of being Antichrist. Now, of course, if the Antichrist is telling you that, and telling you that the mark of Antichrist is resting on the Sabbath, then just do the opposite and you'll figure it out. And we note that in this whole treatment of a tendency to sabbatize the Lord's Day, he seems to ignore altogether any special celebration of the Saturday as a Sabbath, whether as a fast or festival. This silence is probably significant of a change in passing over Western usage altogether, for so far as we can judge, the special observance of the Sabbath there gradually died out. The fasting observance, having prevailed against the festal, was itself naturally overshadowed by the Friday fast. At present, while all Fridays in the year except Christmas Day are fasts, there is no trace of the Saturday fast, except in the vigils of the Easter Day and Whitsun Day, and Saturdays of the Ember weeks. The Eastern Church and the festal observance remained far longer, and indeed is distinctly traceable at the present day. The canonists Zonaros, Balsamon, and Arstinus, representing the tradition of the 12th century, all speak of the apostolic canon as still observed and binding. We have a we have a consultation of Nicolaus of Constantinople about the same time as to the question of standing in prayer on the Sabbath, as well as the Lord's Day, and his answer is that to bend the knee on the Sabbath is not forbidden by the canon, but that men generally, because they do not follow the practice of fasting on the Sabbath, refrain also from bending the knee. Of the significant Eastern usage, we have, again, a slight trace in the West in the Montanist body. Tertullian speaks of a variety of usage introduced by a very few who on the Sabbath abstain from kneeling. The practice, however, he disapproves. He would have it given up or so retained as to avoid offense. For the abstinence from kneeling, he thinks, properly belongs only on the Lord's Day. So people were just getting so wrapped up in all these traditions, and at least you can see how they were just constantly struggling with truth and error, constantly struggling with compromise, and trying to figure out what to do when, in fact, all they needed to do is just read the Bible and have a very simple, decentralized reality. But because there needed to be an institution, and they wanted power and distinctions and hierarchies, there had to be ways of doing things, and we do things differently than you. And this is how the devil got them both. It never seems to have taken any hold in the West, but in the East it's still preserved in the present practice of the Greek, though not on the Russian church. It also held that Saturday is so entirely a day of joy that it is unfit for fasting except always the great Sabbath. And accordingly, if a vigil chanced to fall upon it, it is transposed to Friday, even on Easter Eve. Though it is strictly fast, yet the black of Lent is changed to the white of Easter in all church vestments and furniture. It is curious also that in later times a new specially festal consecration was given to the Sabbath day in the Eastern Church, by considering the great Sabbath of Easter Eve as the day of our Lord's triumph in Hades, giving rest to the spirits in prison, and accordingly looking on all Sabbaths in the year as especially days of commemoration of those who rest in the Lord. Now, we talk about this in my Afterlife series. Jesus did not go to the underworld and release the spirits in prison and all this stuff. The physical Jesus was dead. And the spirit, the Son, can't die, obviously, so that's a mystery. But when Jesus resurrected, during the period of time that he was on the earth, he went to Tartarus, wherever that happens to be, and he proclaimed victory to the spirits who disobeyed, because they formerly did not obey. We're talking about the fallen angels who were imprisoned. Still here also, the greater festal sacredness of the Lord's Day has rightly overshadowed it, and in present thought and usage there is nothing like the quasi-coordination of the days, which we have seen in the apostolic constitutions. Thus, the Sabbath placed between the two great days of a distinctly Christian observance may be considered as parting with its observance, as fast and festival to the one and to the other. In the later ages of the Western Church, as we have seen, a distinctly sabbatical observance gathered around the Lord's Day itself, partly by natural attraction to the great day of worship and rest, partly by enactments civil and ecclesiastical, ultimately by a formal transference of the obligation of the fourth commandment. But it is notable that when the Lord's Day was thus considered to be the Christian Sabbath, it began to be observed with a certain austerity and rigor, differing entirely from the festal character of the Sabbath of the Jews. We are almost tempted to trace in this change a survival of the ancient Western usage, which observed the true Sabbath as a fast. For the chief authorities on this subject, see the Lord's Day. So, mark of the Antichrist, says the Antichrist, if you rest and you keep the Sabbath. These accounts confirm what we read previously, and I just wanted to go over them to recapitulate and show you a couple of things. The hatred for the Jews, for their rejection of Christ, for their persecution of Christians, for being hypocrites on the Sabbath, gave plenty of excuses to argue against Sabbath keeping, especially in the West. Notice Satan's cleverness. Again, he tempts the Jews into evil, then he provides the voice of reason through other people, Gnostics, pagan converts and so on, people like Eusebius who are very interested in keeping their position and flattering the emperor. So he provides the voice of reason and shapes the culture so that it seems justified. Dark and light, all the time. Remember, Augustine and Chrysostom wrote blasphemous things about priests being gods and all sorts of things with the priest being the intermediary role between man and God. Read Dignities and Duties of the Priesthood, or go watch the series on the Pope that I created recently, the DDMP. Even though this work is very biased against the Sabbath, the dictionary that we just read, it does show you clearly that the Eastern Church kept the Sabbath, honored it, And the issue was murky for centuries. For centuries, even after Constantine created that Sunday law. It also shows you the consistent attack against those who keep the Sabbath. At first, it began with fasting. Then you became called a Judaizer and you'd be shut out from Christ. Then pretty much in the 600s, you started becoming called an Antichrist if you keep the Sabbath at all. And so on and so forth. And basically maximizing sin on the earth. So the next thing I want to show you that adds to this narrative is underground cities. This is something you can look to in yourself, but it's just a bit of fascinating history because there are many underground communities of Christians that have been discovered in the Middle East, especially in the East. These are ancient cities that Christians fled to from persecution. And this is on Instagram from The Culturist. And these are just different pictures. If you're listening to this, you can look it up yourself. But it says, in 1963, a man noticed his chickens disappearing through a hole in his basement. He knocked through the wall, revealing what is hard to believe, a 20,000 person city deep below the ground. It was built by Christians over 1,000 years ago. Here's kind of what it looks like. It's got, all these underground. It's just fascinating. It's just such a fascinating bit of history. He had stumbled across what was then the largest underground city ever found near the town of Derinkuru in Turkey's Cappadocia region. But what on earth was it for? Here's what it looks like. All these little places, and you'll see how they even got their water. It's fascinating. Christianity in Cappadocia is as ancient as it gets. Paul the Apostle himself established one of the first Christian communities here in the 1st century. By the 4th century, Cappadocia's bishops played a major role in the Byzantine Empire. But persecuted by Romans, then Persians, and invading Muslim forces, we'll talk about Islam in just a minute, Christians convened in secret for centuries, taking to the remote landscape. That's why you find cave churches there lavished with icons. Close by, the astonishing discovery at Derinkuru was made, but unlike the caves, this is 18 stories and 280 feet deep. You can see what it looks like. Here's kind of like the ground level. And there's this whole thing. It's just fascinating to understand that people were underground in these cities for centuries. The underground city is thought to have been dug mostly in the 8th century and used by Christians and Jews up until the 12th century in the Arab-Byzantine Wars. But it may be far older than that. Here's some more pictures of it. It may have started anywhere between 2000 BC and 100 AD when early Christians might have first needed it. Writings by Xenophon of Athens say people of Anatolia were living below ground in the 4th century BC. So this might have been even much earlier that people were starting to use some of these. Maybe these structures were actually used. Maybe these structures were created long before and then the Christians appropriated them. It's just fascinating to look into. Christians later extended it, planning a living space in which they could spend months on end during a crisis. Upper levels for living, lower levels for storage. There are grain storage rooms, stables, taverns, schools, even a winery into which grapes drop through holes in the ceiling from a vineyard at the surface. Isn't that fascinating? I think this is just mind-blowing. It's all planned masterfully for defense. At the surface, entrances are blocked by massive circular stones rolled into place from the inside. Then, each level is kept secure by similar doorways. How did the people breathe? Via a system of some 15,000 air ducts. Lower down, these double as water wells fed by underground rivers. Water is controlled at the lowest levels, so supply can't be cut off by invaders at the surface. So fascinating. An entire population could simply disappear, taking livestock and grain to sustain them as long as necessary. But they'd have to descend one at a time down its narrow walkways designed to prevent invaders storming en masse. This might all seem hard to believe, but there are others. The city of Matiate, being excavated right now, may have safeguarded 70,000 Christians. So far, they've dug 330 feet, but it might go even further. Crazy. And Derikuyu itself is connected to another city, Kaimakli, via a 5-mile tunnel. It might also be bigger than Derikuyu. Wow. Crazy. In fact, we're only just scratching the surface of how far this all goes. Derikuyu stretches on for miles below ground, and there are maybe 200 cities connected deep beneath the Anatolian plains. Isn't that just fascinating? They were born out of brutal necessity, yet catered for much more than mere survival. Deep down at the 7th level is a cruciform chapel the size of a basketball court. All the stone hand-cut and carried to the surface by the faithful. We go deeper in our free newsletter and so on and so on. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, this would just be so fascinating to visit and to see how people lived for centuries underground with candlelight and singing psalms and so on and so forth. So, conclusion, I mean, this is, again, something you can look into. I think it's fascinating. But these cities were a big part of the Eastern Church, especially with, again, the persecution of the Roman Empire and then eventually the Muslims in the 600s and beyond. And so what's the point of this? Well, they were in the East. And that means that they likely were keeping the Sabbath, especially if they're going underground. They're not going to have, influence from Rome, and they're not trying to be part of the system. So they likely kept the Sabbath. These may have been used even as early as the 1st century, and in that case, they were definitely keeping the Sabbath. They were used by Jews and Christians. And of course, Jews kept the Sabbath, so they had the Sabbath in common, very likely. That's why they probably got along very well. And of course, this fulfills the prophecy of the woman running away from the dragon and having a place given to her for shelter and nourishment for 1,260 years, which I think is just so fascinating. Gosh, it's so fascinating to dig up this history and to see how God's word was fulfilled in great detail. Now, let's talk about Charlemagne and his Sunday law. A lot of Sabbath-keeping sites document a law by Charlemagne in 789 that prohibited working on Sunday, but it's a little more complicated than that as usual. This is Admonitio Generalis. This is on Wikipedia. It's a collection of legislation known as the Capitulatory issued by Charlemagne in 789, which covers educational ecclesiastical reform within the Frankish kingdom. We're dealing now with the Holy Roman Empire. Capitularies were used in the Frankish kingdom during the Carolingian dynasty by government and administration bodies and covered a variety of topics and sorted into various chapters. Admonitio Generalis is actually just one of the many Charlemagne's capitularies that outlined his desire for a well-governed, disciplined Christian Frankish kingdom. The reforms issued in these capitularies by Charlemagne during the 8th century reflect the cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Is there something I highlighted? I don't think I did. So the next thing I want to show you, now that we've gotten context on that, is this. This is the conciliar decrees, capitularies, and episcopal statutes. This is the actual PDF of it. And we're going to look on page 8 to 9 of the PDF. Bearing the pluriformity of the text in mind, it may not be very surprising as the question of whether or not capitularies are law has never been completely solved. But discussions, meanwhile, has started to move in different directions. The most generally accepted solutions so far boil down to yes and no at the same time. So this is an essay. It's an essay on this law, or these set of laws that he passed, because it's not so cut and dry, but it is important to understand what happened. Alfred Eckhart, for instance, states that not all capitularies were law, whereas Janet Nelson points out that capitularies should, at least in some cases, also be regarded as statements of ideology, and not only as normative and legal. And Christina Posel has recently suggested that capitularies are at least belong to the realm of law. Thomas Martin Buck, in turn, has emphasized the religious Belendran character of capitularies, which opens up refreshingly different perspectives on the whole issue. He makes the important point that capitularies were indeed normative, although they did not necessarily reflect daily reality, but rather ideals thereof. These ideals, in turn, were not meant to become reality immediately, but represented the blueprint for an ideal society in the future. Following Walter Ullmann, Buck points out that a lot of the admonishments contained in the capitularies were not enforceable laws in the first place. To take just 2 examples of the Admonitio Generalis, it must have been completely impossible to enforce the admonition to all to celebrate Sundays for the full 24 hours, let alone to punish those who acted against it. So yes, did Charlemagne pass this law, or I should say decree, to not work on Sundays? Yes, he did. But it's not as easy as that, because you'll see that it, just like with Rome 400 years before with Constantine, it wasn't universal, and enforcing it is not very easy. That's why at the end, there's going to be a technocratic system where the beast can finally enforce this worldwide that it's always wanted to and tried throughout time. The element of ideals for the future is even stronger in section 62 that calls, among other things, for peace and harmony between bishops, counts, and judges, and the Christian people in general. The whole question concerning the effectiveness of the capitularies relates and related texts can in this way also be seen in a different light. If we regard these admonishments as expressing ideals of reform, they can indeed be considered as normative in intention without necessarily being directly effective law. This is, to my mind, a very fruitful shift in perspective as it moves the discussion away from rather strict notions of law in favor of a wider view of the meaning and working of these texts. So we know, again, that where Satan dwells and he proclaims these moralities through his pagan empires and pagan rulers out into the world, constantly proclaiming the blasphemy. And that doesn't mean that is enforced immediately, because it was still not completely centralized. But the proclamations are made over and over to create precedents and shape culture and so on. This is exactly what happened with Charlemagne. It's not clear whether these things were hardcore laws, because of the Sabbatarian sites, argue that Charlemagne passed this hardcore law and everybody was basically held to gunpoint. That's not exactly right. But he did pass these decrees that were, at the very minimum, let's put it this way, statements of ideology. Statements of ideology of what is our cultural goal with this empire. We want people to rest on Sunday, which is very well documented. Now, this is Sunday Observance and the Sunday Letter in Anglo-Saxon England. And this is a book that outlines the history of medieval Sunday observance, which also is very interesting. We're going to read a section about the Admonitio Generalis, as well as some other related events with it. We're going to look on, this is 270-page book. We're going to look on what page here? 29 through 32. All right. And we can zoom even actually a little more to see it. The development of Sunday observance. Carolingian legislation. The Carolingian evidence is of interest here mainly because of its ties to the late Anglo-Saxon period when the extant Old English Sunday letters were produced. On the whole, we see a repetition and strengthening of earlier legislation, along with additional efforts to develop a rationale for Sunday rest. In any case, there can be no doubt that Sabbatarianism had gained significant foothold by this time. The best-known illustration of how detailed the Sunday prohibitions had become is found in Admonitio Generalis, issued by Charlemagne in 789, which stipulates that the work in the field and vineyard, plowing, harvesting, mowing, erecting of fences, felling of trees, as well as building of houses and garden work are all prohibited. So contrary to Constantine's law, now the rest of that stuff is prohibited 400 years later. The use of a cart is allowed only in certain specific circumstances. Women's work, such as sewing, weaving, and washing of clothes, is also forbidden. The opening assumes scriptural support for what follows, and Charlemagne denies that restriction of these activities in any way innovative. He refers to the memory of his good father, who issued similar edicts. So Charlemagne wasn't the first. Before him, and you saw the popes and the emperors and Theodosius II and so on, there was always a man on the throne to proclaim the morality of Satan and to continue it into the world and to proclaim it. Because if you don't, then the next generations are going to forget and they're going to return to the basics. So you have to keep flooding the world and shape it and shape it and shape it to your desired outcome. The Sunday letter, however, is condemned in the same document. It would appear because of its overnight stringent views on Sunday observance, but as part of a list of heterodox writings where it is denounced as epistola pessima falsima, a most wicked and false letter, which should not be believed or read but burnt. The purpose of embracing a work-free Sunday is made clear in Admonitio and in other legislation from the same period. The establishment of a well-regulated Christian society, particularly among the newly converted, required a day devoted to attendance at Mass and instruction in Christian morals. The Council of Frankfurt in 794 specified that an entire day from Saturday evening to Sunday evening is to be set aside. Another council, which took place around the same time in Italy, stated that the Lord's Day begins with Saturday evening with the tolling of the church bell and urges all to devote themselves to prayer and church attendance. Interesting, again, how they're following the Jews in that reckoning with the evening-to-evening reckoning, which is not true. In addition, the statute offers a rationale for the dignity of Sunday, which would also be inserted into the later versions of the Sunday letter. A rudimentary form of the Sunday list, a catalog of important events said to have happened on that day, and here including the resurrection, Pentecost, the feeding of the 5,000, the first man in the desert. Subsequent councils also addressed Sunday observance, but not always in quite the same detail. The local council of 813 appear to agree that court cases, servile work, and trade, not mentioned in the these are not mentioned in the admonitio, that they should be forbidden. So successive councils added to the blasphemy and basically continued to strangle people away from the Sabbath and into Sunday. Two additional witnesses to the development of Sunday observance merit our attention. The records of a council held at Rome in 826, including an extended homiletic argument which quotes the Old Testament Sabbath law as though it referred to Sunday, and, like Caesarius, holds up Jewish Sabbath keeping as a shaming example. A similar, even more lengthy canon in the records of the Council of Paris, 829, claims that the obligation of Sunday rest is backed by holy fathers and the authority of the Church, and bemoans the fact that compliance has all but disappeared. Drawing on elements we have already seen elsewhere, the canon provides a short Sunday list and reports Straufunder, in which those engaging in farm work were struck by lightning, disabled, or burned to ashes in an instant. So fear, conjectures, apostolic succession, apostolic traditions, anything to get you to do what the beast says. The Jews who obey their Sabbath laws without any earthly compulsion here are again brought up as a positive example. Here we see the full arsenal of current thinking applied to the defiant breaker of Sunday laws. The honor of the day derives from the authority of the Church and its historical significance as a day of miracles. Jewish Sabbath keeping is meant to shame Christians, and the threat of horrific punishment is designed to instill fear of divine retribution. In such a context, the Sunday letter, by this time spreading prolifically throughout the West, must have seemed a plausible aid, and in at least one region, it seems to have had an exceptionally central role to play. Sunday observance in Ireland. This is also very, very interesting. As these developments were taking place in the continent, a particularly intense Sabbatarianism seems to have found adherents in Ireland. It is difficult to date precisely when this began or how widespread it was, but there can be no doubt that the Sunday letter played a significant part in the movement. The textual evidence includes three related documents which often appear in the manuscripts together: an adaptation of the Sunday letter into Old Irish, the Epistle Issue, the Law of Sunday, and three Straufunder narratives concerning Sunday observance. Remarkably, the first two of these texts are in fact based on the Sunday letter, a copy of which probably arrived in Ireland at least as early as the beginning of the 9th century. It was translated and its prescriptions incorporated into elaborate legal tracts which offered specific fines for violating Sunday and describing the manner in which offenders are to be identified and prosecuted, as well as the exceptional circumstances under which the prohibitions, particularly those concerning travel, may be suspended. There is even reference to Sunday guarantors and bailiffs, who apparently were responsible for enforcing the code. Today, those bailiffs are going to be AI. Little AI in your pocket spying on you. In character, these legal portions resemble Irish secular codes of the period, though they were most likely compiled by clerics. The origin of these texts is uncertain, and the legal codes may have never been widely enforced. D.A. Binchy suggests that the Cain Domneg, I don't know how to pronounce that in whatever Celtic, was a local production, perhaps intended to produce a revenue for a monastic federation. However, it is worth noting that the interest in the subject matter appears to coincide with the emergence of a strict Sabbatarianism associated with the appearance in the late 8th century of the Clients of God in Ireland, an ascetic reform movement. In keeping with their high regard of the Mosaic law, they had advocated strict Sunday observance, which included prohibitions against washing, splitting wood, eating food prepared on Sunday for married lay members, and prohibiting sexual relations. However, such Sabbatarian attitudes may not have been entirely new to the Irish. There is evidence for it as early as the end of the 7th century in Muiruchu's Vita Sancti Patrici. In one chapter, Saint forbids heathen folk who are making a wrath to work on the Lord's Day. When they ignore this warning, a storm destroys their work. In another chapter, we are told that Patrick would not go out from Saturday evening to Monday morning. Several other lives of saints, we'll learn about St. Patrick, it's very interesting. Several other lives of saints who lived in the 7th and 8th centuries, though composed much later, also hint at a similar tradition of strict Sunday observance featuring restrictions such as the washing of the head and cutting of the wood. I think that was it for this paper. So, conclusion, there were many things happening during this time, and you can see Satan is very busy and going out into the world just as he was in the first couple centuries. He has not ceased. He is ceaseless. Sabbath-keeping sites tend to oversimplify these things and say that there were Sunday laws and going out in the world from Charlemagne, but it's not that simple. It's a lot more nuanced and complicated. And if you can see the nuance, you can see how these things work through time. The reason I documented these things is because I want you to see just how patient and conniving and clever and relentless the devil is. He's constantly shaping reality until change becomes inevitable. And that is exactly what he is doing now at a very rapid pace because he has control of the whole world. If you realize what kind of enemy you're dealing with, then you see how history is going to repeat itself, because all of these things will be repeated very soon and very quickly. In 508, Clovis converted to Catholicism, and the Frankish kingdom became Catholic, which was a huge territory, a huge win for the Catholic papacy. 30 years later, Justinian of that kingdom made the Pope the head of the church, and that begins the 1260 period of the Little Horn basically being the Grand Poobah and reigning with the, over the saints and so on. Of course, it wasn't easy for the Little Horn. I document this in my papal series on the popes, where the Little Horn was constantly having conflicts with its power between other councils that were trying to usurp its power, other monarchs, other nations and so on. It was a constant strife for the beast. And that strife forced it to expose its dark heart. Like the letter that Pope Leo IX wrote to the Patriarch in Constantinople. And we are, the presence of God on earth. We are the ones that are chosen by God. And so you have these constant conflicts that force the beast to show its fangs, and then people can see when they look in history what you're dealing with. But of course, the problem is most people don't look in history. Within 200 years of the Justinian decreed to make the Pope the corrector of heresies, you start seeing Sunday sacredness and enforcement of Sunday rest on Sunday going throughout the whole world of that empire. Within 200 years. Of course, again, you have to remember these things were already starting to be shaped since Constantine. But they're pockets of things. They're pockets. They're not these universal things that are happening. Charlemagne proclaimed some official policies of the empire, citing some work of his father before him. So that shows you that these things were not his idea, but they were building on previous traditions. And these things were going out throughout the West and also to the English Isles, like Ireland. Charlemagne had other synods and councils, like the Synod of Mainz in 813 and so on, where these things were propagated more and more, just like Constantine had other synods and Theodosian and after him and so on and so forth. Enforcing these things was not 100% possible. That's why Satan was trying to continually shape the culture, because enforcing these things is not 100% possible. That's why he's been so hungry for this New World Order. And through technology, he will obtain the enforcement and worship that he's wanted, because God has allowed him to have it. But nevertheless, Satan was still building the ideological foundation by setting precedents and proclaiming his morality throughout the world. Remember that at this time, the East was still honoring the Sabbath, and you'll see even more examples of that even actually the Irish were keeping the Sabbath, which is fascinating with St. Patrick, because there's evidence that St. Patrick brought that practice into Ireland. Even though modern Catholicism props St. Patrick up as a Catholic, you'll see that he was actually against Catholicism, which is interesting. But notice, again, Satan doesn't waste any time. He doesn't waste any of his chips, any of his psyops. Everything's going to be used. The Sunday letter that it was being discussed here is the epistle from the Council of Laodicea that warned people not to Judaize. And it caused controversy, but it also was being used and repeated everywhere else as doctrine. It was a document saying, no, look, this is church doctrine now, we have to obey it. That's the Sunday letter that's being documented in here. It became the source for many traditions and fanaticism around Sunday for centuries. So what Constantine did set the precedent for wave upon wave of culture shaping throughout time. And later emperors would pick up on it and say, oh, well, see, they would cite the Sunday letter and so on. And some people disagreed with it, and you had the fasting issue. It was very, very complex and complicated. Now, the next thing I want to show you is early Christians in British Isles kept the Sabbath. This is a book by James Moffat, and it's called The Church in Scotland. And I want to talk about some history here in Scotland and Ireland and everywhere else in the British Isles, which is very, very fascinating history. It's important to understand because people were keeping the Sabbath holy also there as well. They had an existing practice to which Rome replaced eventually with all their cultural shaping and dialectics and the sword and everything else. Infiltrations, you'll see with Margaret coming up here shortly. The missionaries that reached France and Britain, originally that area, were from the school of John, who ruled the churches of Asia and basically Asia Minor. That whole area was influenced by John and from that school, like Polycarp. Remember that Polycarp kept the Sabbath and Polycrates and so on, and they kept the Passover. So those missionaries passed on that tradition to the area of France and Britain and the British Isles. Colonists from Asia Minor laid the foundations of the pre-Patrick church in that area because they brought the teachings from Paul, from John, from Philip, and so on, which included the Sabbath, which we have established quite a bit until now. So this book, again, The Church in Scotland by James Moffat, it's a scholarly work. He's a Presbyterian historian, and he's a theologian. This was published in 1883, and it reviews the religious history of Scotland. So we're going to look on page 152 of the PDF. And this says, it seems to have been customary in the Celtic churches of the early times in Ireland as well as Scotland to keep Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, as a day of rest from labor, and Sunday, commemorative of the Lord's resurrection, as one of rejoicing with exercises of public worship. Just that. If you just learned that, wouldn't that be something? All these Irish Catholics that don't know their history. In that case, they obeyed the fourth commandment literally upon the seventh day of the week, the day on which the Lord lay in the grave. I did not understand the precept about resting from labor to apply to the day of rejoicing over his resurrection. So the early Christians of these areas, because of their connection back to John and Philip and Paul, kept the Sabbath. They did not think that remember, the author of this book is not a Sabbath keeper. He's a historian, okay? So he has no interest in promoting the Sabbath keeping. But he documents that these early Christians were keeping the Sabbath, and they did not see Sunday as a day to be resting for the Sabbath. It was a day to get together and keep it as a Christian day, but not as the Sabbath. The Sabbath is still the Sabbath. The more you know, right? On the latter, people did not feel under obligation to refrain from any of their ordinary occupations consistent with their attending upon public worship. The Queen insisted upon the single and strict observance of the Lord's Day. People and clergy alike submitted, but without entirely giving up their reverence for Saturday, which subsequently sank into half-holy day preparatory for Sunday. So Saturday became now the preparation day. You see the sleight of hand that the devil did? He moved the week over by one. So instead of basically keeping the Sabbath on the seventh day, you keep the Sabbath on the first day and you prepare for it on Saturday. That's exactly what he's done through all of these dialectics. And of course, we're talking about Queen Margaret, and we'll talk about that in this next book. This is The Rise of the Medieval Church by Alexander Flick. It was published by a Methodist historian and theologian in 1909, and it covers the history of the church in the 5th century and beyond. We're going to look at quite a few things here. So what did I highlight on here? Page 237. Let's see. Page 237. No, 237. Here it is. This is the transcribed text of this book on a web page. The monks sent to England by Pope Gregory the Great soon came to see that the Celtic Church differed from theirs in many respects. Augustine himself, having concluded an alliance between Ethelbert and the Roman See, held several conferences with the Christian Celts in order to accomplish the most difficult task of their subjugation to the Roman authority. Remember that Augustine was one of the bedrocks for Catholicism. And these people had been Christianized by missionaries that were from the, Jewish Christian, the Paul and John and Philip, and with their traditions. So Augustine was trying to get them to submit to this Roman way of doing things. These differences were largely ritualistic and disciplinary. The Celtic Christians celebrated Easter according to the calculation of Sulpicius Severus, while the Romans had another mode of computing the proper day, i.e. the Celtic churches were quartodeciman. Does that mean that they kept the Sabbath? Yes, it does. The Celts appealed to St. John, the Romans to St. Peter. The Celtic church might be called a monastic church since the abbot ruled over the bishop. The Celts shaved the front of their head from ear to ear as a tonsure, while the Romans shaved the top of their head, leaving a crown of thorns. The Celts permitted their priests to marry. The Romans forbade it. The The Celts used a different mode of baptism from that of the Romans, namely single instead of true immersion. The calendar for all of the movable festivals was not the same. The Celts held their own councils and enacted their own laws, independent of Rome. How dare you? The Celts used the Latin Bible unlike the Vulgate and kept Saturday as the day of rest, with special religious services on Sunday. Boy, did Rome did not like that. The Celts were practically Eastern Orthodox, which is kind of interesting. But that is that. Here's another one from History of the Catholic Church in Scotland by Alphonse Bellersheim. This is another historical book published in 1887 by a Catholic Church historian. He documents the interaction between Columba, who was a missionary heavily influenced by Patrick, and this is in the 6th century, 597. In the passage, he admits that the Celts kept the Sabbath also at that time in 597. So let's look on page 140. This is from a Catholic theologian. Towards the end of May 597, the holy abbot desired to visit the western part of Iona. Unable, though, age and weakness, to proceed thither on foot, he was carried in a car drawn by oxen. When the brethren had gathered around him, he said, "During the Paschal solemnities in the month of April now past, with desire have I had to depart to Christ the Lord, as he had allowed me, if I preferred it. But lest the joyous festival should be turned for you into mourning, I thought it better to put off for a little longer the time of my departure from the world." At these words, the brethren broke out into tears and lamentations, while Columba, still seated in his chariot, blessed the island with its inhabitants and was carried back to his monastery. On the following Saturday, Sabbath, leaning on his faithful attendant, Diarmaid went to bless the granary. "This day," said Columba, "in the Holy Scriptures is called the Sabbath, which means rest. And this day is indeed a Sabbath to me, for it is the last day of my present laborious life, and on it I rest after the fatigues of my labors. And this night at midnight, which commenceth the solemn Lord's Day, I shall go to the way of our fathers." Now there's a little commentary here. It says, "We seem to see here an allusion to the custom observed in the early monastic Church of Ireland of keeping the day of rest on Saturday or the Sabbath, while Sunday was distinguished by the special religious celebrations. This was one of the customs opposed by St. Margaret, who was the Catholic infiltrator that basically made them change to the Roman way of doing things with the edge of the sword 5 centuries later." So, in the 500s, actually late 500s, early 600s, people were keeping the Sabbath. The Celts were keeping the Sabbath, folks. This is The Life of Margaret by Turgot. He's a bishop of Andrews and confessor of Margaret. It was published in 1884 with commentary, and it documents yet again that the Celts kept the Sabbath. So let's see, on page 57 to 59. Let's read about Margaret. Good old Margaret. This is, did I highlight it? Oh, wait a minute. Page 49 to 51 of the book. So we have to be on a different page. Oh, okay, well, that was fun. I actually had my sources mixed up. There's one more source I want to show you before we get to the life of Margaret. This is a history of the Scotland from the Roman occupation by Andrew Lang. It was a multi-volume historical book published in the early 1900s by a renowned historian. And the passage in question we're going to be looking at details the end of the Celtic Church and becoming basically integrated to Rome because of Margaret's efforts right around the time of the Great Schism, which is around 1000 AD. So in this book, we're going to look on page 1. I was like, where the heck did I do this? Here it is, 134. And this is page 96 to 97 of the actual book. So this says, "The Scottish Church then, when Malcolm wedded the saintly English Margaret, was Celtic, and presented peculiarities odious to the English lady, strongly attached to the establishment as she knew it at home. With all her virtues, Margaret was that in Scotland we call very English, that is, very correct and punctilious. Her private interests, however, in her son's lay benefices were not touched by her reforms. Probably Malcolm was firm on this point. Her biographer and director Turgot, which we'll look at, his book, represents her as holding councils to decide between the Celtic and English church fashions, while the worthy Malcolm interpreted, as he, if no theologian, at least knew both Gaelic and English. The Celtic priests must have disliked the interference of an English woman. First, there was a difference in keeping Lent. The Celts did not begin on Ash Wednesday, but following the early rule, on the Monday following. On Easter Day, they did not communicate. There were also masses in I know not what barbarous rite. Perhaps, as Mr. Skene suggests, the service was celebrated not in Latin, but in the vernacular. God forbid, right, that people understand what you're saying. The Protestant Bishop of Edinburgh, Dr. Dowden, suggests that more probably an extraordinary Irish way of arranging fragments of the wafer in a cross and a circle may be the subject of the illusion. They worked on Sunday, but kept Saturday in a sabbatical manner. Now this is, by the time Margaret is coming into the picture and marrying this Malcolm guy, this is now like close to around 900 or 1000 AD, I forget exactly when, but it's around that time. So they were keeping Saturday as a Sabbath, and that was very offensive to Margaret, who was loyal to the beast. A man might marry his deceased brother's wife, and even, it is said, his stepmother. These things Margaret abolished and brought the Celtic customs into Christian conformity. You mean Catholic conformity. But the hereditary lay benefices, these, as we said, were left unreformed. Margaret's own son, Ethelred, was lay abbot of Dunkeld. Margaret was pious, charitable, correct, and learned. She presented golden crucifixes to churches. She established hospitia for pilgrims. She restored the sacked and ruined monastery of Iona. A little miracle was wrought for her. Her book of devotion fell into the water and was not injured. Indeed, it may now be seen in the Bodleian Library, having been bought for £6 at a clearance of a parish library in England. But St. Margaret, with all these merits, did not or could not touch the lay benefices. The ingenious Malcolm was, on that point, firm as a rock. Thus, with Margaret came the beginning of the end of the monastic Celtic Church of Scotland. And in Malcolm's last year died Fotad, the last Celtic bishop of Alban. He was followed by an interregnum of 14 years, from 1093 to 1107, and then came a stranger bishop. Henceforth, the clergy of St. Andrews, for example, began to bear English names. Celtic names gradually disappeared. The St. Andrews culdees, though they yielded place to the Augustinian canons, were finally converted into the provost and chapter of St. Mary's of the Rock. To anticipate, we may note that as late as the Great War of Independence, this chapter was maintaining its right to elect a bishop, namely their provost, William Comyn. The perjured and patriotic William Lamberton, the friend of Bruce, was the candidate of the National Party. Edward I supported Comyn, and thus the survivors of the old Celtic ecclesiastical body, like the military Celts of Galloway, the Isles, the Lorne, were then opposed to the national interests of Scotland. Every reader of Scottish history must observe how, in the change of times and ideas, the wind so harsh to Ireland to Scotland was tempered. The new Anglo-Norman ideas entered Scotland by infiltration. An English queen, her English children, gradually introduced changes which in Ireland came in the wake of conquest and the sword. For example, the ecclesiastical novelties which St. Margaret's influence gently thrust upon Scotland were accepted in Ireland by the Synod of Cashel under Henry II. Yet there remained in the Irish Church a Celtic and Anglo-Norman party, which hated one another with a perfect hatred, as if they rejoiced in the designation of Protestant or Papist. The form of hatred Scotland was happy enough to escape, though we do find a movement against English clergy in the stormy 6 months of Sir William Wallace. These things are each in themselves historical dives that you could spend hours and hours and hours learning the history, but you can see the same patterns over and over again. Infiltration, culture shaping, policies, councils, proclaiming the morality, taking over and eventually enforcing that morality with power and force and whatever else and gaslighting. Now, this is the life of St. Margaret. And we're going to look on page 57 to 59 of the PDF. Let's see here. This is actually a little bit earlier, 56. This is item 20. Again, there were certain places in Scotland in which masses were celebrated according to some sort of barbarous rite, contrary to the usage of the whole church. Fired by the zeal of God, the Queen attempted to root out and abolish this custom, so that henceforth from the whole of Scotland there was not a single person who dared to continue the practice. It was another custom of theirs to neglect the reverence due to the Lord's Day by devoting themselves to every kind of worldly business upon it, just as they did upon other days. This is contrary to the law. She proved to them as well by reason and as by authority. Let us venerate the Lord's day, she said, because of the resurrection of our Lord which happened upon that day, and let us no longer do servile works upon it, bearing in mind that upon this day we were redeemed from the slavery of the devil. The blessed Pope Gregory affirms the same thing. We must cease from earthly labor upon the Lord's day, and we must devote ourselves entirely to prayer, so that upon the day of our Lord's resurrection we must make expiations for such negligences as we may have committed during the 6 days. Remember the same Pope Gregory that says you're an Antichrist if you keep the Sabbath? That's the mark of the Antichrist. The same Father Gregory, after censuring with the greatest severity a certain piece of worldly business which had been done on the Lord's day, decreed that the persons who had advised it should be excommunicated for 2 months. These arguments of the arguments of the Queen were unanswerable, and from this time forward these prudent men paid such respect to her earnestness that no one dared on these days either to carry any burdens himself or to compel another to do so. So through charisma, through theological arguments and surreptitious metaphors and typologies, and eventually the sword and counsels and everything else, Satan used the same weapons that he always uses. And of course, the barbarous practice they're talking about is keeping the Sabbath, and also probably having services in your mother tongue so that people can understand it. That was barbarous to them. Very fascinating history. This is one more on this topic. This is Seventh-day Baptists in Europe and America. It's published by the Seventh-day Baptist General Conference. This is a series of historical papers commemorating the anniversary of the conference. It was published in 1902. And the section in question we're looking at discusses the Sabbath keeping in Wales. So let's see, page 71 of the PDF. Wales. There is much evidence that the Sabbath prevailed in Wales universally until AD 1115. So until the 12th century, my friends, the Sabbath keeping was persisting in Wales. When the first Roman bishop was seated at St. David's, the old Welsh Sabbath-keeping churches did not even then altogether bow the knee to Rome, but fled to their hiding places where the ordinance of the gospel to this day have been administered in their primitive mode without being adulterated by the corrupt church of Rome. That's J. Davis, Baptist History, Chapter 1. Isn't that fascinating? So, conclusion from all of this stuff, if you're Scottish or Irish or English and you're a proud Catholic, then I bet you didn't know this interesting history. I bet you didn't, because I didn't. Funny, because all the white Israelite proponents hate the Jews, and yet when you look at history, you have 700 plus years of easy history that you can document where people kept the Sabbath. And actually, it's more than 700 years. It's well over 1,000. Some say that Patrick was a Sabbath keeper, and there's evidence he resisted Rome and had a more biblical faith than he brought when he brought there than what it eventually became, obviously. It would make sense because the apostolic tradition he got and brought with him is from John and Philip and Paul, and we know that those people kept the Sabbath. We know these things also from documents about his disciple. Oh, what's her name? His name? C? Something with a C that we read about, how he died on a Sabbath and he kept the Sabbath holy and so on. So that altogether is very obvious that St. Patrick probably kept the Sabbath and was maybe even a quartodeciman. Who knows? But nevertheless, there's great evidence to suggest that Patrick was keeping the Sabbath and brought those things with him. Today, Patrick is a major Catholic saint. Funny enough, but he was anything but a Romanist. He was not for the Roman power. He was not in alignment with Roman teachings. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church didn't even touch Patrick for centuries. And then when the culture in Ireland was shaped with Charlemagne, with St. Margaret, with dialectics with Britain, all of these things that happened over hundreds of years. Once that was shaped and then the Catholic identity was well rooted in the generations, then suddenly now Patrick became the patron saint and he became a Catholic figurehead. But Patrick, if you actually look at Patrick's history and you study the early church in Ireland and Scotland and in that whole era, British Isles, they were not Roman. They were not Roman or Western in their understanding. They didn't fast on the Sabbath. They kept the Sabbath and they had it as a day of resting and rejoice. Of course, they had their own traditions too, like the Orthodox, mixing truth with error, but nevertheless, they kept the Sabbath. They saw that as the day to rest, not Sunday. So that's important. After 1100s, the English had constant turmoil with Rome, with power struggles with their various monarchs. Then eventually you had the Reformation, which caused more turmoil and, basically splitting from the Catholic Church. But then the, Protestant nations wanted their own institutionalization. And of course they kept Sunday, and England eventually gave rise to the Puritans. The Puritans were super militant with Sunday keeping, and then they came to the United States. So one thing after another, the mystery of iniquity and the deception went out into the world, and the rest, as they say, is history. So you have to learn the truth by going way far back in history, because you're at the end of time, and Satan has been very patient to cover his tracks for most people because they aren't willing to look at the 800s or 900s or 1000. Just like everywhere else, it proves to you that early Christians kept the Sabbath. Yet again, I'll say it. Even 700 years after Constantine's Sunday law. Very important. Now let's read about Photius of Constantinople. We mentioned him earlier, but about 50 years after Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire promoting, their Sunday sacredness, you had dialectics begin with the East and West and fasting, and ultimately it would culminate in the Great Schism. Photius was a patriarch of Constantinople in 867, and a major event happened with him and the Romans that would culminate in the Great Schism 200 years later. He excommunicated the Pope, and it was a huge deal, it was a huge controversy. But one of the reasons documented was because Rome was enforcing its Sabbath fast. So I want to document that. We were documenting it before, but this is just a reiteration of that. Photius said that the emperor and the court on his side, instead of obeying the Pope to whom he had appealed, he resolved to deny his authority altogether. Ignatius was kept chained in person. The Pope's letters were not allowed to be published. The emperor sent an answer dictated by Photius saying that nothing Nicholas could do would help Ignatius, that all the Eastern patriarchs were on Photius' side, that the excommunication of the legates must be explained, and that unless the Pope altered his decision, Michael would come to Rome with an army to punish him. Photius then kept his place undisturbed for 4 years. In 867, he carried the war into the enemy's camp by excommunicating the Pope and his Latins. The reasons he gave for this in an encyclical sent to the Eastern patriarchs are that they fast on Saturdays, the number one reason. And of course, we read the other reasons too. So the number one reason, listed first, why in the 867, 9th century, why the East excommunicated the West is because they make the Sabbath a burden. And we document that. But what does that show you? That people were keeping the Sabbath well past Constantine. Now, let's talk about Pope Leo IX. We mentioned him in that previous paper, and the Great Schism, and changing the Sabbath also. There's a lot to talk about in this particular little segment, because we're going to be looking at a site that I've documented before on Michael Scheifler's site with Vicarius Filii Dei. But we'll get to that in just a second. The dialectics of the Sabbath fasting issue reached a climax in 1054. And that obviously caused the Great Schism. Learning about the things that led up to this and how it happened gives you an appreciation for how the early church and the Eastern church especially kept the Sabbath for centuries. And it's an important thing to document. We'll also be looking at several resources concerning the Great Schism, and also a resource on basically the Pope's claiming the authority to change the Sabbath from 1582. This resource is part of a greater study, like I said, with Vicarius Filii Dei. See my series on the popes for this. We're not going to look through this whole thing. We're just looking at a couple tiny sections. I don't agree with everything that Michael Scheifler says. He denies the Trinity. He's hardcore, I think, for Ellen White. So, just use discernment if you do look at this website. But it's as far as the blasphemy of the popes is concerned, he does a great job. So we're going to look here in this section with... He talks about the donation of Constantine, which is a forgery that Rome used for centuries to justify its power. And this is one of the documents that was used by Leo IX to say, look, you owe us obedience because God gave Peter the throne. And they used this forgery, which was a forgery that was written in the 9th century. So Pope Leo IX, 1054. I just want to read you this little section about this letter. Here's the letter. And it says this. The letter begins with the Institutalio Intitutalio Leo Episcopus Servus Servorum Dei, which is characteristic of official papal bulls. It was addressed to Michael Cerularius, Patriarch of Constantinople, and Leo, Metropolitan of Archida. It was in response to a letter sent by Leo, Metropolitan of Archida, to John, Bishop of Tranum of Bulgaria. Remember the whole Bulgarian issue they were having too. That categorically attacked the customs of the Latin Church that differed from those of the Greeks. Especially criticized were the Roman traditions of fasting on Saturday Sabbath and consecration of the unleavened bread. Leo IX in his letter accused Constantinople of historically being the source of heresy and claimed it in emphatic terms that the primacy of the Bishop of Rome over even the Patriarch of Constantinople, who would have none of it. After Leo's assertion of primacy was summarily rejected, Patriarch Cerularius was excommunicated by papal legates, who entered Constantinople's St. Sophia during the liturgy of July 16th in 1054 and publicly threw down the bull that anathematized Cerularius on the altar table. By that dramatic act, the church was split into two in the Great Schism, and that was ever since divided the East and the West. So the Great Schism, a big part of it was papal supremacy, but it was also a big deal was this fasting issue on the Sabbath, that the West was trying to force people to profane the Sabbath and to make it a burden. And the East was resisting, and eventually, of course, they were culture-shaped too after the schism happened. Now, I want to look at this document with the popes changing the times and the laws here. This is later. These are a lot of documents. I've covered these in the series on the popes, but this is the Pope changed Sabbath to Sunday. Satan's policy in his final yada yada yada. Below is question 50 of Summa regarding the third commandment from the 1582 edition. I think this is Summa Potesta, like what can the Pope do? What powers does he have? These 6 points, this is the original document. These 6 points regarding papal ability to grant dispensation are proposing that the popes innately possess the authority to overrule the Sabbath commandment of God as written in the Bible, and so are able to change it in any aspect, however they should decree. Here's the Latin, and underneath we're going to read the text. Now we must consider dispensation of the third commandment in regard to 6 arguments. First, whether the Pope can grant dispensation that the Sabbath day should be observed in a spiritual sense, not literal, according to the Bible. Again, what is the strategy of the devil? To change something that God has said literal and physical to spiritual, because if it's spiritual, then it can be reinterpreted. Secondly, whether the Pope can grant dispensation changing the Sabbath day to the Lord's day. Third, whether the Pope can grant dispensation permitting servile work on the Lord's day. Fourth, whether the Pope may strictly prohibit servile work on the Lord's day as it was prohibited on the Sabbath. Fifth, whether the Pope can grant dispensation permitting market buying and selling on the Lord's day. Sixth, whether the Pope can grant dispensation so that the war may be waged on the Lord's day. So, when the Bible tells you that you will not buy or sell, if you don't obey this power and you don't take the mark of lawlessness upon you, is that confirmed with history? Absolutely. The Sabbath day law has been changed by the Pope to the Lord's day due to the preeminence of things signified and the excellent factors in agreement with time and circumstance. This is the resolution of point under Article 2 shown above, resolutio. So after these arguments have been established, that the Pope has the power to dispense with God's laws, he can transfer the day and he can tell you the rest. He can prohibit work if he wants to. He can do whatever he wants with that law. The resolution is that the Sabbath day has been changed by the Pope to the Lord's day. There it is, there's the Latin. Dies Sabbati in diem Dominicam iure a Papa mutata est. We can change the times and the laws. So the same document that applies Vicarius Filii Dei to the Pope, which is the Vicar of the Son of God, which the Catholics deny, which is very well documented, see my series, credits the papacy with changing God's commandment from the seventh day to the first day of the week, Sunday. So there's that. Now, here's another one, the Sabbath in the Great Schism of AD 1054 by R.L. Odom. This is a theological article published in 1963 by Andrews University Seminary Studies, and it talks about this whole Great Schism thing. Early in the Christian era, there developed a cleavage between the church leaders in Rome and those in Constantinople, a breach which widened with the passing of the centuries until the last tie that bound them together in Christian fellowship snapped in the summer of AD 1054. One of the main issues involved in that controversy was the matter of fasting on the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. In 1053, the disagreement on this topic became verbally violent. In that year, Metropolitan Archbishop Leo of Archida then the capital of Bulgaria, but now a city belonging to Albania, and Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople, wrote an open letter to Bishop John of Church of Trani in southern Italy. This church was on the side of the Greeks in the controversy. The message, written in Greek, was addressed to Your Holiness Bishop John, and through you to all the chief priests and the priests of the Franks, and the monks and the peoples, and to the most reverend Pope himself. It was a vigorous protest against the Roman practice of making the Sabbath a fasting day, of using unleavened bread in the communion service, and requiring the clergy of practice celibacy, of using the blood of animals and the flesh of strangled or suffocated animals for food, etc. Cardinal Humbert, Bishop of Candida Silva, got a copy of the letter and placed a Latin translation of it in the hands of Leo IX, Bishop of Rome. About the same time, Nicetas Stathos, a learned monk and presbyter of the monastery of Studion in Constantinople, wrote his booklet against the Latins, in which he attacked those practices of the Roman Church. He accused this church of having violated the injunction of the so-called apostolic constitutions against fasting on the Sabbath, and of having contravened the canons of various church councils which had forbidden this practice. Moreover, he declared that the Roman clergy had no authority from either the scriptures or apostolic tradition for making the Sabbath a fast day. His treatise circulated far and wide and had the approval of the Patriarch of Constantinople. In the meantime, the Patriarch of Constantinople closed all churches of the city which practiced any of the alleged errors of the Latins. Leo IX wrote a long letter of 41 chapters in the letter part of 1053 to Patriarch Michael Cerularius and Archbishop Leo of Achrida, in which he argued that he was the successor of the Apostle Peter and that he was invested with supreme authority over the universal church, and that his word was law for the faithful to obey. He did not present any other defense for his acts. Cardinal Humbert, a favorite of the Roman bishop, wrote a response to the attack by Nicetas. In 1054, Leo IX sent a papal legate to Constantinople. This legation consisted of Cardinal Humbert, Frederick, Deacon of Chancellor of Church of Rome, and Peter, Archbishop of Amalfi. By the hand of these legates, Leo IX sent also a long, harsh, haughty, and imperious letter to the Greek Patriarch Michael Cerularius, in which he reiterated the demands that the Roman pontiff and his voice be recognized as supreme in the universal church. By the same means, he sent a letter to the aged Greek Emperor Constantine Monomachos, in which he used moderate and kind language in the hope of enlisting the latter's sympathy and support. The papal legates arrived at Constantinople prior to the death of Leo IX in April 1054. The papal see remained vacant for a year thereafter until it was filled by the election of Victor II as pontiff in April of 1055. However, the papal nuncios to Constantinople had received definite instructions before leaving Rome as to what they should do in case their mission should fail or succeed. Hence, they did not have to wait for the election of the new pope in order to act. After their arrival at Constantinople, the legates from Rome interviewed both the patriarch and the emperor, and delivered to each of them his respective letter from the Roman pope. So Cerularius, the Greek patriarch, was offended and angered by the letter that Leo IX had written him. Moreover, he felt insulted by Humbert's attitude toward him. On June 24th, 1054, Humbert and his two associates proceeded to the monastery at Studion and publicly debated there with Nicetas Stathos, in the presence of the emperor, his court, and other persons of high rank in affairs of state and church. They spent their time thereafter in the city without accomplishing anything of significance. The patriarch refused to be interviewed by them again, feeling that he had been insulted and that such a visit would be useless. Finally, seeing that their mission to bring the Eastern churches into submission to the Bishop of Rome had failed, the papal legates staged the dramatic act that produced the Great Schism. Proceeding to the Church of St. Sophia on July 16th, and about 9 o'clock in the morning of the Sabbath day, interesting again that it happened on the Sabbath, when preparations were being made for the religious services of the day, the Roman emissaries bitterly denounced the Greek patriarch and all who sided with him. Then, having spoken their piece, they very quickly placed upon the principal altar the Vatican's writ of excommunication against the churches of the East and their clergy, and walked away, shaking the dust from their feet. The alert deacons of the church, it is reported, quickly snatched up the document and tossed it out upon the pavement, where it was torn to shreds by the multitude. Michael Cerularius, who quoted it later in a document concerning the whole affair, got a copy of it. The papal legation, soon on its way back to Rome, was overtaken by the emperor's messengers and urged to return. This final attempt by the emperor to effect a reconciliation between the two great sectors of Christendom proved unsuccessful. and Humbert and his companions were soon on their way back to Rome. Besides all this, Cardinal Humbert wrote a treatise entitled Adversus Calumnias Graecorum, against the calumnies of the Greeks, which is composed in the form of a debate between a Roman and a Greek. After turning to the Sabbath question by quoting Exodus 20, he has the Roman spokesman saying, "Therefore, in such observance of the Sabbath, where and what day do we Latins have anything in common with the Jews?" We read this part previously. Yada, yada. Okay, Hadrian, the first bishop of Rome, in the 8th century, in his epistle 70 to Bishop of Aguila of Spain, and Nicholas, the first bishop of Rome in 858, in his epistle 70 to Archbishop Hincamar and others, not only speak of the papacy's quarrel with the Greeks over fasting on the Sabbath, but both of these popes cite Sylvester I as having endorsed and defended the practice. So the evidence is there that Sylvester did endorse the practice. It's not like a lot of letters, but there are some letters that point to this. And so it stands to reason that Sylvester did institute and continue the practice from Calixtus in the 200s. These are similar, having been said by Sylvester, the tradition of... Okay, yeah, we looked at that. Afterwards, in a letter to the Patriarch of the Church in Antioch, Michael Cerularius reported the recent happenings at Constantinople and explained why he had refused to yield to the demands of the papal legates that he submit to the dictates of the Bishop of Rome. Concerning the matter of the Sabbath observance, he said, quote, "For we are commanded also to honor the Sabbath day equally with the Sunday, Lord's Day, and to keep it and not work on it." Toward the close of the 11th century, the rigor of the Roman hierarchy in regard to fasting on the Sabbath began to relax. This is also very, very important history. You see what the devil did with Sabbath after basically making people fast, creating the schism. Now there's dialectics. Now once that's served its purpose, the devil switched his tone with the Sabbath. You'll see what he did. While in the meantime, a notion of the seventh day of the week should be devoted to the worship of the Virgin Mary was made popular. Fasting on the Sabbath as a regular thing has ceased among Roman Catholics in general. Few of them now devote the daily especially to the worship of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The Greek churches, while not officially repudiating Sabbath observance, have so neglected the seventh day that, to all intents and purposes, it has ceased to be regarded as a date of rest and worship among them as it used to be. And I think that's that. So, conclusion. These things document the tensions over fasting on the Sabbath well into the 1100s. It's important because it shows you that the East honored the Sabbath even until that time. At the very least as a day not to be burdened, to rest, to rejoice in, and to worship. In another resource, you saw clearly that those who obey the ordinance of the rest to rest on Sunday are obeying the throne of Satan. Because when the popes in 1582, when they decreed that we have basically the authority to change God's laws, just because it was officially decreed in 1582 doesn't mean there weren't previous decrees by the man of sin, as you've seen hopefully throughout this entire presentation. From very early on with Calixtus proclaiming that to make the Sabbath a burden by fasting, and continuing through each successive pontifex, whether it was the Bishop of Rome or the Roman emperors, then eventually the popes themselves, these authorities claiming to rewrite God's laws and adding to the blasphemy and the character of this false morality over and over again throughout time. And when you obey, you are obeying and agreeing that it is good and lawful and true what the popes have said in history. We'll get more on that when we talk about the mark of the beast and what it truly is. But nevertheless, it shows you that the devil is consistently exerting influence, and he's not going to quit. He's not going to quit until he has total and utter world obedience and domination, because that is what he has continually strived for in the last 2,000 years. And God has decreed that the devil will be successful. All of this technocratic stuff is so that you can enforce behavior and control people from, basically, if they don't participate in the spiritual system, then they'll be kicked out. Notice the same old tactics. Gaslighting. If you don't fast, you're not a Christian because you're not mourning Christ. Or, you're basically a Jew, a Judaizer, you're a Christ killer. Using intimidation, smoke and mirrors, conjectures of apostolic succession, donation of Constantine, apostolic tradition, whatever else. Any kind of conjecture that they can bring to mind with clever metaphors and spiritualization and reasoning to get you to capitulate, which is exactly what they're going to do very soon when all these things come back into the culture. Very quickly, folks. All of these taxes are going to be coming, so get ready and be prepared for them. Now let's talk about the Ethiopian Church. It's well documented that the Ethiopians persisted in Sabbath keeping throughout all of these historical changes. And it proves to you that the people kept the Sabbath since the very beginning. So this is Wikipedia. Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is the largest Oriental Orthodox churches, one of the few Christian churches in Africa originating before European colonization of the continent. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church dates back to the Christianization of the Kingdom of Aksum in 330. It has between 36 million and 51 million adherents in Ethiopia. It is a founding member of the World Council of Churches. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is in communion with other Oriental Orthodox churches, yada, 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 so on and so forth. Now, let's see. There's a section here that I highlighted. I know for sure somewhere that there was something with the Sabbath. Let's see. Here we go. Just search for the Sabbath. This is under similarities to Judaism and Islam. Before praying, the Ethiopian Orthodox remove their shoes in order to acknowledge that one is offering prayer before a holy God. Ethiopian Orthodox worshippers remove their shoes when entering a church temple, in accordance with Exodus 3 verse 5. Furthermore, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is known to observe the seventh-day Sabbath, Saturday or the Lesser Sabbath, in addition to the Lord's Day, Sunday, or the Christian Sabbath. Again, they have truth with error. You're very far in history now, so truth has been mixed with error and tradition. They are not immune from the devil's schemes, but they are offering to you a timestamp going back into antiquity. Now that you have the breadth of history to look at, you can see that continued all even into the modern day. Recognizing both to be holy days of joy, prayer, and contemplation, although more emphasis because of the resurrection of Christ is laid upon Sunday. While the Ethiopian Church is known for this practice, it is neither an innovation nor unique to it, deriving from the apostolic constitutions and the apostolic canons, the former of which, without the apostolic canons included, is in the Church's 81-book canon as Didaskalia. The nature of the Sabbath only became a doctrinal dispute in the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria in the centuries leading up to the issue being rectified by Iwalstetuos. The Emperor Galodeus, in his confession and apologia of traditional beliefs and practices, says, quote, "We do not honor it as the Jews do, but we so honor it that we celebrate therein the Eucharist and have love feasts, even as our fathers, the apostles, have taught us in the Didaskalia." So these things were carried through time, and of course, little by little, they were also corrupted. But nevertheless, they show you the truth. Unfortunately, the Ethiopians think that Saturday is the lesser Sabbath, so you can see the problem with that. But the original Christians kept the Sabbath, and they were quartodecimants. Again, not that you have to keep the Passover, but these things are time-stamped historically to show you that the Jewishness of the church was what was first, and then through paganism and through infiltrations and Gnosticism, it changed. The East kept it after the early church basically started becoming more centralized in Rome. And through these conflicts, you can see evidence of its continuation all the way into the 1100s, and even with the Ethiopians today, which they're a very unique church in many regards. But they all became susceptible to tradition eventually, and anti-Jewish hatred, and so on and so forth. Ethiopia, I don't think, had too much anti-Judaism or anti-Jewish hatred, just like India. And so this thing was allowed to flourish and basically acts as a continuous timestamp going back to all the way to the early church. Now, some other Sabbath keeping throughout time. It's important to discuss briefly just some various Sabbath keeping groups throughout time because it is relevant to the discussion and also to have a narrow road approach on it. Although it's difficult to find lots of documentation on people who resisted institutionalized religion, especially early on, like the 700s and 800s, because people were running away, they were hiding underground and so on. It is clear already from everything we've looked at that there were always people keeping the Sabbath. There were always some group of people that were in conflict with the institutional power. That's pretty clear. The challenge also with this, though, this is the narrow road, because the Protestants and especially the Sabbath-keeping sites and Seventh-day Adventist sites make it very generalized. There's the Protestant lineage going back to the early church and they were always being persecuted by the beast. Well, yes, but the nuance of this, so you don't get into harlotry and saying, oh, we're the Protestants of the chosen church. There were always groups of people keeping the Sabbath, but some of these people were also not people that could be considered Christians. Okay, and this is also another tactic of the devil, another clever tactic to get the people who were keeping the Sabbath to bait them with legalism or other Gnostic ideas so that the Sabbath could be discredited even further. Which is, again, it's like, man, the devil is just ceaseless in his attack on this command. So it's important to have historical nuance. Now, there's the Nazarenes, who were throughout time, we've mentioned them here and there in these different texts. They were legalists probably because they also kept the Mosaic customs, but they also said they were Christians. So, Nazarenes are a complex thing. Very likely they were probably legalistic to some degree. You had the Pelagians or the Pelagians in the 12 and 1300s. They believed in circumcision. They denied the deity of Christ. They were legalists. You had the Albigenses or the Cathars in the medieval times who were very persecuted by the Catholic Church. Absolutely. They were slaughtered like animals, but they weren't Christians. You can't use the Albigenses and say, oh, look, they were true Christians. They weren't. They were Gnostics. That's pretty well documented. The Waldenses could be called Christians, I think. They kept the Sabbath, but they also had legalistic problems too. I don't think they were clinging to the Mosaic covenant like the Nazarenes or the Pelagians, but they had problems with asceticism and, basically being hyper poor, hyper fasting, hyper humble. I don't believe they believed in marriage. They had some weird things. They were probably sincere Christians, but they were also trapped with legalism, which again, that's a tool for the devil. That's why the narrow road is not legalism and it's not Gnosticism. This is the narrow road with the Sabbath. On one side, you've got Gnosticism and over-spiritualization. The devil's seducing you with all these typologies of the resurrection, everything else that we looked at. And on the other side, he's baiting you into legalism and having to obey the law and so on. So either way you go, the devil's going to use that to discredit the Sabbath and present his solution. You had the Picards in the 1400s. They were a radical sect that split off from the Hussite movement, if you know anything about that, and emerged in the area of modern Czech Republic. They rejected Sunday and the authority of the Pope, but evidence is lacking that they kept the Sabbath. So maybe a few did. It's not clear. Obviously, people were very interspersed at that time. It's not black and white. People kept the Sabbath here and there, and that took a long time for the beast to enforce his morality, and there were always people that were rejecting. So is there evidence that the Picards kept the Sabbath? I haven't found any super convincing evidence. There may be. I'm not discounting it, but nevertheless, they were living in communes. They had their own issues. They rejected private property. They thought they were already perfect, and they were basically beyond sin, so they were perfectly sanctified. So they had some really strange beliefs. Some even believed that their leader was the Christ. So it's all over the place with some of these people. You had the Lollards in England. They were pre-Puritan. They rejected the church feast days. They rejected the church authority. But there's no clear evidence that they kept the Sabbath. Some Sabbath-keeping sites say that the Lollards were Sabbath keepers. I haven't seen super convincing evidence to document that fact. So, conclusion with all of these things, and these are just a couple snippets that are commonly mentioned in this discussion. It's important to walk the narrow road on history and on Scripture all the time. Otherwise, you're not going to find the truth. Because Satan is very clever, folks. Satan is incredibly clever. And if he can't get you with one thing, he's going to get you with another. That's why the narrow road is so important. If he can't seduce you, he's going to attack you. If he can't get you with desire, he'll get you with fear. Always some form of an imbalance. It is true that people kept the Sabbath from the beginning throughout all of time. You always had people keeping the Sabbath. However, a very big however, for the people that didn't want to bow down to the beast, Satan deceived them with other means, whether it's legalism or Gnosticism. This is A, to destroy them away from touching the gospel, and also to discredit the Sabbath further to the world while the beast system is taking power and enforcing its morality, so it seems justified. It's always been this double attack, and this particular attack that I'm describing to you over and over again is coming on the horizon. You will see a duality between the solution of unifying church and state, of proclaiming Sunday rest, of people becoming obsessed with Sunday sacredness again in the Eucharist and everything else, and bowing down to this authority, and the demonization of people who don't want to participate. As Jews, as Judaizers, as heretics, pick your flavor. Just look in history and you'll know exactly what to be called. Modern Sabbath keeping sites talk about these groups throughout time as sort of a remnant, in quotation, to make their cause seem justified. I know the Adventists do this quite a bit. Even the KJV onlyists tie all their things back to Antioch, and there's this perfect preservation of the Antiochian text, which is just such gross overgeneralization of history. Same thing with the Protestants and the Seventh-day Adventists or Sabbath keepers, and say, look, the remnant through history has always kept, God's Sabbath, and they were persecuted. Well, yes, people were always persecuted because a lot of people didn't want to bow down to this system, but not all of those people were like genuine Christians. So there's that. That's the narrow road on this issue, because many of them had serious doctrinal issues, and they cannot be propped up as a model of Christianity. They can't. The people who believed in circumcision and they denied the deity of Christ, or they thought they were perfectly sanctified, these are not Christians, folks. You cannot be called a Christian if you believe these things. You can be called a Christian if you believe the gospel, but then, you think maybe you need to fast 3 times a week. That's not a salvation issue. That's not a super doctrinal issue. It's legalism, but it's not, a doctrinal issue that's like questioning your faith. But if you deny the deity of Christ, then yeah, you're not a Christian. I'm sorry. If you believe in duality, where there's an evil force and a good force and they're both equal, that's Gnosticism. You're not a Christian because you don't believe in the sovereignty of God. So we have to be very careful with these things. But another side of that is that not all of them were also, false believers or false converts or, heretics that are completely lost. So there's somewhere in there were genuine people keeping the Sabbath. Those people were also surrounded by people that were being baited by Satan, as usual, with Gnosticism or legalism, and being lumped into the fold. That's why I said, at the end, they're going to use, if you're a narrow road Fennec Fox Christian, where you're trying the best to just follow the Bible and have a simple, profound walk with Jesus, that is going to be lumped in with all of the people that don't convert, that Satan is going to cash his chips on, that he's deceived with either Gnosticism or legalism. The New Agers that don't want to be part of this and they're still in Gnostic land, the black Hebrew Israelites that are keeping all the rules and they're super legalistic, the Torah keepers, the sacred namers, all of these people that are just these cults that Satan deceived in various ways to distract them from the gospel so they're destroyed, and to destroy the association of the Sabbath as something that you should do. All of these people are going to be lumped into one group, and you are going to be lumped in with them. It's the same thing that he's done throughout history. And again, if you study history, you see these things pretty clearly. You have so many examples now, and all of these people who are going to resist the system will be lumped into one category of people that need to be persecuted. And maybe, again, God will use that for the good and bring those people as, thieves on the cross as the final people to come out of their own deceptions. Maybe being a black Hebrew Israelite, some of these people will be, once they're persecuted for not resting on Sunday and obeying the papal authority, maybe that's going to help them come out of this system. And some of them will repent and finally realize the error of their ways. But who knows? The point is, all of these things will be used as justification to put you in the same group as everybody else and call you a heretic. This is why understanding history and also having a narrow road approach to everything is so important. You need nuance and you need to avoid imbalances, because the imbalance is how the devil works. The devil works by putting you off balance, because when you're off balance, you are predictable. I learned about this from 20 years of studying movement in my life on a professional level. When you are off balance, you are predictable. Because if, let's say again, if I'm leaning super far forward, the more forward you lean, the more predictable it is the direction you're going. You got it. If you're really leaning super far forward to the point where you're almost falling, well, the outcome is predictable. You're going to fall forward. But if you're standing up straight and neutral, you can go in any direction, right? That's why the narrow road is so important, is to avoid these imbalances in ideology and thinking and emotion because the devil works by putting you off balance. Oh, you're not going to go to the left. How about to the right? Oh, okay. How about to the right? How about this way? How about that way? And then once you're in that predictable position, then you can be manipulated. And that's exactly the point. And you see that every deception, every delusion that there is, whether it's dispensationalism or Judaism or Islam or Gnosticism, any deception, just pick your flavor. It's always an imbalance, because then that imbalance can be manipulated. So it's important to understand these things, folks. The Sabbath is a moral command, and it's given for your good. It's a delight. We don't keep the Sabbath to be saved. We keep the Sabbath because we're saved. And it fulfills us and reveals God's gospel in a physical way every week, which is a beautiful thing. It's not a burden, it's a joy. And it always has been, and it always will be the seventh day. No traditions, no legalism. This is how you will have to make your case against the coming accusations. We're not legalists. We don't see the Sabbath as necessary for salvation, as in the sense of like obeying the Sabbath perfectly is necessary for salvation. There's no traditions. It's a matter of the conscience, how you interpret certain things. Obviously, the big ones should be avoided, like commerce, like doing work that you normally do, doing manual labor, doing food prep, all the things that you normally do during the week that you consider work. Don't do them on the Sabbath. Outside of that, what are the things that are good to do? Well, reading the scriptures, going out in nature, having fellowship with others, helping the poor, preaching the gospel. All of these things are lawful to do. Resting, doing nothing, relaxing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's supposed to be a delight, meditating on God's words and God's infinite nature and the plan of salvation. That's what the Sabbath is for. It's a delight. And you have to understand that the Sabbath as a truth is in between these two imbalances that the devil always will try to argue, either Gnosticism or legalism. In my comment section, I always have the people who are the Torah keepers and say we need to keep the feast and this and that and that. Then you have the Gnostics who are saying, well, no, Jesus is my Sabbath, not realizing that their arguments come from Gnostics 1800 years ago. So nothing new under the sun. Now, another thing I want to talk about is Islam. The rise of Islam and its subsequent dissolution in 1800 was about from 600 to 1800, about 1200 years that it was really influential, militarily speaking. But it's another factor in this story, and it's important to understand because according to prophecy, Islam was raised up as a power to judge the beast, and specifically the Byzantine Empire. If you need clarity for that, watch my End Time series, the episode on the trumpets, or my Daniel and Revelation walkthrough. Now, some Seventh-day Adventists or Sabbath-keeping sites say that the Roman Catholic Church created Islam, but the evidence for this is very spurious, and I don't think that's something we need to be arguing. However, I discussed the relationships between the Roman Catholicism and Islam in my video, Did the Catholic Church Create Islam? Islam is still related to the Catholic Church spiritually, because Islam is a harlot daughter of Rome, because Rome is the mother of abominations and they are both part of the mystery religion. So there's a relationship there. I've said this before, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. Islam is a giant Unitarian church. It is Catholic Unitarianism. When you see Islam as Catholicism but Unitarian, not Trinitarian, then it makes complete sense. And it's a profound thing to see. So nevertheless, watch that video to get a narrow road approach on this issue, because there's definitely a lot to talk about. But the Roman Catholic Church is definitely integral in the formation of Islam for many reasons, culturally, politically, and also, of course, spiritually. The Arabs were primed and ready to be deceived for their own version of religion, their own militant religion, and Satan gave it to them, using Catholicism as a model through Muhammad. But the point is this, Islam took over where the Eastern churches were, and because Muslims hated the Jews and were at war with the Catholics, they picked their own day to be unique, because they're a harlot daughter, so they picked Friday. So there was this increasing pressure now from the Muslims to don't keep the Sabbath, because don't be like the Jews, just like you had with Rome. First you had with Rome in the West, then Islam in the East, and of course Satan always is using the sword and the persecution simultaneously with the false light of Gnosticism and over-spiritualization as the solution. So it's the same tactic that happened with Islam. For those hundreds of years, you saw people were running away and hiding, and oftentimes Christians and Jews was both hiding together away from the beast, which is very, very interesting. Now, the next thing I want to show you is in the 1400s. This is Cantate Domino by Eugene IV. I covered this it's an encyclical by one of the men of sin. I covered it in my Pope series, but it's worth revisiting just for getting in touch with the blasphemy of this institution. It's a decree in 1442 that basically those who keep the Sabbath are to be shut out from Christ. So if we look on Cantate Domino, and where is this highlighted? Somewhere here in the text. There's no section, you just kind of have to find it. Omnes ergo post is the text that starts it. But remember, this is 100 years before the popes said that we have the right to dispense with God's laws. Therefore, after that time, all those who observe circumcision and the Sabbath and other legal observances are declared to be alien to the faith of Christ and can be never be partakers of eternal salvation unless they repent of these errors. So unless they repent, they are alienated from the flock and they lose their salvation. If you obey God, you are anathema, according to the snake. Just like all of his predecessors, Eugene IV blasphemed God and added to the blasphemy with his own versions and his own decrees and encyclicals. And if you notice the history and the evolution of this, from proclaiming the fasts in the 3rd and 4th century to calling Christians who keep the Sabbath antichrist in the 7th century, now you're threatening them with losing salvation and death in the 15th century. And then, of course, in the 16th century, the document we saw previously with the popes changing the laws, they're basically saying we can do whatever we want with God's law. The popes have consistently been against the Sabbath throughout history. You can see that very clearly. They've been against the word of God and they've blasphemed God every chance they get. So now, with all that out of the way, there's one more thing I want to show you, which is terribly profound. History. This is another resource, and it recapitulates some blasphemies of the papal institution over time and over the course of the last 2,000 years concerning Sabbath and Sunday. On top of the fasting dialectic and the spiritual and political shenanigans that were going on that I've described to you ad nauseum, Satan continued through time to blaspheme God by appropriating signs and wonders to the Sabbath, which basically built a culture of idolatry on God's special day. So once he was done with the fasting dialectic, you'll see the shift that it went from dark to light, from being a day of mourning to basically burdening people so that Sunday could be, proper. Once that sleight of hand had been done and the Roman Empire had been enforced throughout, by the time you got to the 1200s, it was fairly common for people to be keeping Sunday and honoring that Sunday. Well, by then, okay, we're done with that. Now it's time to have appearances of Mary and make Sunday a day of worshiping Mary and basically add to the sin with idolatry and everything else. So this article is from National Catholic Register, and it covers history from the early 400s into more modern times. It's titled, Proof That Saturday is Mary's Special Day. Ugh. What connections are there from early church to apparitions like Fatima that make Saturday Mary's special day? Let's see. Let's find out, folks. Saturday, November 27th, 1830 was the day before Advent began that year. That Saturday, our Blessed Mother appeared to St. Catherine Labouré in the chapel of the Mother House of the Daughters of Charity in Paris to give her the miraculous medal. Describing the design, Our Lady also said that the medal was to have the inscription, O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. The medal was to be spread far and wide. It was and continues to be. Really quick pause. We know that Mary is dead in the ground, waiting to be resurrected. And so that means that the apparition that appeared to St. Catherine Labouré was not Mary. And not only did this apparition choose to appear on a Sabbath so that that day would be associated to itself, it is also commanding the doctrine of Mary being conceived without sin, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is 100 years before the popes officially made it doctrine. But of course, this was already being discussed, and the devil was appearing and proclaiming this doctrine more and more, that Mary is the sinless one. So then when you're honoring Mary on Saturday, you're honoring a false Christ. So the devil was not content with just changing the day from Saturday to Sunday. He had to blaspheme God on top of that. Saturday, September 19th, 1846, was the day Mary appeared as Our Lady of La Salette to the young shepherd children Melanie Calvat and Maximum Girard with a major message about changing living patterns and turning back to God. And if you look into these messages every single time, they're so blasphemous. They're so contrary to the gospel. So obviously Mary is not appearing to these people. But Satan is, and they are completely deceived. Saturday, December 9th, 1531, Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared for the first time to St. Juan Diego. The Julian calendar was still the calendar in use during that time. She told Juan to tell the bishop to have a chapel built there, for in truth I am your compassionate mother, yours and all who live together in this land, and of any others who love me, seek me, and call on me with confidence and devotion. In that house I will listen to their weeping and their sadness. I will give them help in their troubles and a cure for their misfortunes. Now, in a couple years from the date of this video, we are in 2025, in 6 years, you're going to have the anniversary, the 500th anniversary of this satanic apparition. I wonder what's going to happen on that day. Saturdays are surely Mary's days right from the start. Saturday's deep roots. Not long after the resurrection in the early days of the church, honoring Mary in major ways began on each Saturday. As Sunday was the Lord's Day, Saturday soon became Mary's Day. Saturdays stand out among those days dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the Vatican's director of popular piety and liturgy tells us. In a great talk given in 1947, Our Lady of Fatima, servant of God, Jesuit Father John Hardon, so the Jesuits, they're the ones who put that apparition on, probably through a bunch of black magic, gave a clear picture of history of Saturday being Mary's Day. He highlighted some peak points of the development of Marian devotions on Saturdays, observing that we may reasonably suppose that the last day of the week was specially dedicated to Our Lady from the first centuries of the Church. No, it was not. No, it was not. He pointed out that St. Innocent I, who reigned from 401 to 417, wrote the faithful a significant letter decreeing that each Saturday was to be observed as a day of abstinence in honor of the sorrows of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So the fasting now, that go back now 1,600 years to Innocent, the fasting, this wasn't documented. I might have been in that book. I didn't find it there, but the fasting that Innocent began to proclaim as church policy in the 400s was already starting to also be grounded in basically the sorrows of Mary and Mary's sorrows, and then that set the precedent to honor Mary on the Sabbath. So, gosh, it's just so satanic. Skipping to the 8th century of St. John Damascus, made known that Saturdays were dedicated to Mary in the Church of the East and celebrated as such. Saturday masses in honor of Mary are found in the 9th and 10th century liturgical books. Truth with error. St. Bernard, Thomas, and Bonaventure explained the dedication of Saturdays to Mary by pointing to the time of Christ's rest in the grave. Everyone else had abandoned Christ, only Mary continued to believe. This was her day, notes another source. In the late 11th century, Blessed Pope Urban required priests and monks to pray the office of the Blessed Virgin on Saturday, and votive masses of the Blessed Virgin were decreed for every Saturday of the year unless prohibited by explicit rubrics to the contrary, noted Father Hardon. His personal Marian devotion led Urban II to compose a Mass preface in her honor, which was still used in the later 20th century. Saints substantiate Saturdays. In the 12th century, when St. Bernard of Clairvaux arrived on the scene, Father Hardon said, a new era was born in the Church's devotion to the Mother of God. St. Bernard was a major Marian devotee. Listen to St. Bernard's preaching. Quote, in dangers, in doubts, and difficulties, think of Mary, call upon Mary. Let not her name depart from your lips, never suffer it to leave your heart, and that you may obtain the assistance of her prayer, neglect not to walk in her footsteps. With her for guide, you shall never go astray. While invoking her, you shall never lose heart. So long as she is in your mind, you are safe from deception. While she holds your hand, you cannot fall. Under her protection, you have nothing to fear. If she walks before you, you shall not grow weary. If she shows you favor, you shall reach the goal. Really quick pause. If Mary is dead, who are you praying to? As God. And who is going to appear to you and convince you that your prayers have reached Mary and she's on your side? Important questions. Here's what St. Bernard preached about Mary that put the firm foundation on why Saturdays are devoted to her. In Mary alone did the faith of the Church remain steadfast during the 3 days that Jesus lay in the tomb. And although everyone else wavered, she who conceived Christ in faith kept that faith that she had once for all received from God and never lost. Thus could she wait with assured hope for the glory of the risen Lord. Do you see? Gosh, we still have more to read. Oh, we still have more to read. Do you see how evil and utterly conniving the devil is? Whether it's Peter's mourning or fasting or Mary's mourning, always something that seems so good and rational to get you completely off into apostasy. Again, blasphemy disguised as the will of God. Then St. Thomas Aquinas, who, remember, says that obedience to the pontiff is necessary for salvation, interpreted why Saturdays were dedicated to Mary. Custom of dedicating Saturdays to Mary. Father Hardon quotes Aquinas, who asserted the following: "Since the resurrection took place on a Sunday, we keep holy this day instead of the Sabbath, as the Jews did of old. However, we also sanctify Saturday in honor of the glorious Virgin Mary, who remained unshaken in faith all day Saturday after the death of her divine Son." In the 16th century, St. Charles Borromeo prayed the rosary in Our Lady's office every day, on his knees. Father Hardon describes how the saint, on hearing the Angelus bell, though the ground might be wet and muddy, he would fall on his knees even in the public street. Over the main door of every church in the archdiocese, he caused an image of Mary to be placed as a reminder of the faithful that she is the gate of heaven. St. Alphonsus Liguori, who has, like I've said, lots of blasphemous things to say in his duties of the priest, records of him that he fasted on bread and water every Saturday of the year in praise of the Mother of God. This is about as satanic as you can get. You are blaspheming God by making the Sabbath a burden, which is supposed to be a picture of the gospel, and you are succumbing to fasting and legalism and making it a burden, which basically says that you're making the gospel a burden. You're making the death of Jesus Christ and the salvation of mankind a burden, which is pictured in the Sabbath. On top of that, you're dedicating that blasphemy to the devil. Gosh, it's just so profoundly evil. And yet all of this is wrapped in godly, righteous metaphors and symbols and this and that. And these things will be coming back into the forefront very soon. On Saturday, November 3rd, 1584, St. Charles Borromeo died. On Saturday, December 14th, 1591, another Marian devotee died, St. John of the Cross. Father Hardon said, an eyewitness testified on oath that John of the Cross declared a few hours before he died, "The Mother of God and of Carmel hastens to purgatory with grace on Saturday and delivers those souls who have worn her scapular. Blessed be this merciful lady who wills that on this day of Saturday I shall depart from this life." This is like, you know, the Greek legends of Charon, the guy with the black robe and the sickle that comes and takes you across the river, and basically you give him some coins and you go to the afterlife. How is that any different than the Mother Mary hastening to bring all the souls from purgatory to heaven or whatever else? This is paganism 2.0. And in the package of Christianity. Father Hardon noted that in the 18th century, St. Alphonsus Liguori wrote, "It is well known that Saturday has been set aside by the Church as Mary's day, because it was on the Sabbath after the death of her Son that she remained unshaken in her faith. For this reason, the clients of Mary are careful to honor her on that day by some particular devotion, and especially by fasting. I affirm that those who practice this devotion can hardly be lost. Not that I mean to say that if they die in mortal sin, the Blessed Virgin will deliver them, but that those who practice it will, through Mary's help, find perseverance in God's grace easy and obtain from her a happy death. On Saturdays, we should always practice some devotion in honor of our Blessed Lady, receive Holy Communion or hear Mass, visit an image of Mary or something of that sort." All of these are going to be coming back into the culture for Sunday sacredness and this religious system that will obtain obedience from the world. Saturday's major role. Fatima again highlights the connection to Saturday Marian devotions. On Saturday, October 13th, 1917, was the day the big miracle occurred in Fatima, the miracle of the sun, and the day Mary identified herself as Our Lady of the Rosary and also appeared as Our Lady of Sorrows and Our Lady of Mount Carmel because of the importance of the scapular. Does this sound like, even if, let's just say that we had immortal souls and people could float up to heaven, first off, would God ever allow Mary to appear to you and do all these things and say all these things? No, that's number one. And would Mary put on all these little masks to be, oh, Mary of this, I'm a lady of that, a lady of this, lady of that? No, not at all. But we don't have immortal souls that persist after death. We are immortal in the resurrection. And those who reject God and obey the false Christ will not have immortality. Saturday, December 17th, 1927, Sister Lucia had a vision of Jesus in Pontevedra, Spain. She went before the Blessed Sacrament in the tabernacle because she wanted heaven's permission to reveal part of the secret her spiritual director asked her to include in her memoirs. She asked Jesus how she should comply with what had been asked of her, that is to say, if the origin of the devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary was included in the secret that the Most Holy Virgin had confided to her. Lucia continued in the third person. Jesus made her hear very distinctly these words, "My daughter, write what they ask of you. Write also what the Most Holy Virgin revealed to you in the apparition," in which she spoke of this devotion. As for the remainder of the secret, continue and keep it silent. Is this consistent with what the Jesus of the Scriptures speaks? When Jesus, actually God in both Testaments, both Old and New, says, "I have said nothing in secret." I have said nothing in secret. Why would God need secrets when he's God? The devil needs secrets, but God doesn't need secrets. And of course, this apparition that is claiming to be Jesus is affirming the other apparition that was also Satan. These are both Satan. Satan's putting on this mask and putting on that mask and pretending to be Jesus or Mary or Peter or Paul or Michael or whoever else. He needs to pretend to be and deceive these people into a false religion. He's deceiving them into Satanism, disguised as the will of God. What has Lucia referred to that she was asked to reveal? It was about devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, another major part of the Fatima message. She wrote this specifically in 1917. Our Lady said, "Jesus wishes to make use of you to make me known and loved." Yeah, Jesus wants you to be devoted to me, not just to him, but to me, to my Sacred Heart. He wants to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. I covered this in one of my End Times episodes. I promise salvation to those who embrace it, and these souls will be loved by God like flowers placed by me to adorn his throne. So this apparition, which is not Mary, promises salvation to those who embrace devotion, world devotion, to my Immaculate Heart. Is that Mary? Is that Jesus? Or is that Satan? There's the all-important devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary that Jesus tells her to reveal. He told this to Lucia on Saturday, Mary's Day. Also, what major request did Our Lady make at Fatima? Devotion of the 5 first Saturdays. So not only blaspheming God on Saturdays, but requiring that you continue to blaspheme God even more on Saturday. Profound. "Look, my daughter, at my heart surrounded with thorns with which ungrateful men pierce me every moment by their blasphemies and ingratitude. You at least try to console me and say that I promise to assist at the hour of death with the graces necessary for salvation. All those who on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months shall confess, receive Holy Communion, recite 5 decades of the Rosary, and keep me company for 15 minutes while meditating on the 15 mysteries of the Rosary with the intention of making reparations to me." Why are you making reparations to Mary? Why? It's so profound that these people do not see this thing. It's just so profound to me that they are so under the delusion of the devil. The reference to the first 5 Saturdays devotion on the day the Church dedicates to Our Lady and combining with the Holy Communion and then with the Rosary that Our Lady asked for during each of her apparitions, couldn't it be a clearer request and promise? Oh, it couldn't be clearer, all right, what's going on here, if you have eyes to see. Neither could the reference to Our Lady of Sorrows, as Our Lady also appeared during the Miracle of the Sun on October 13th. The Miracle of the Sun. Who else likes the sun? Although little known, on Saturday, October 13, 1973, Our Lady appeared at Akita, Japan, and to Senor Agnes Sasawaga, Sister Agnes Sasawaga of the Handmaids of the Eucharist, with some dire warnings for the world if people did not repent. Saturday, May 13th, 2017, the Church celebrated the 100th anniversary of Mary's appearance in Portugal as Our Lady of Fatima, bringing an essential message to the world. Isn't it time to make sure to honor Mary every Saturday? Yeah, no thank you. Not in a million years. So, that's that. My goodness. From 1095 with Urban II all the way to the 1920s with Fatima appearances on the Sabbaths, Satan added countless blasphemies and doctrines and signs and wonders, just like the Bible says, through councils, edicts, Marian appearances, miracles, quote unquote, and so on. At the same time, Rome relaxed its policy on the Sabbath fasting after the Great Schism, because again, by the 1100s, 1200s, the deception had gone out into the world, and the whole fasting dialectic accomplished its purpose. But you saw even early on with Innocent, this attack was dual. It was a dual attack intended to one day go from dark to light. At first it was about fasting, but even that was grounded in honoring Mary because she was she was very sad on the Sabbath. So it was from the very beginning, a dual Antichrist attack. But for the most part of that first 1,000 years, it was about pushing people to fast on Saturday and make it a burden so that Sunday could be the solution. Once that was done, everything was accomplished, no more need for that. Suddenly now you start seeing appearances of the devil on Sabbaths to continually build the narrative that, the Sabbath is actually the day that you devote to Mary and worship. So it was time to go from dark to light and basically make the final act of blasphemy against God. I want you yet again, to get an appreciation for how truly evil and just conniving the devil is. Satan is not satisfied with people stopping to keep the Sabbath. That does not satisfy him, to get you to stop keeping the Sabbath and honoring God the way that he has. He's not satisfied with that. Satan wants to receive worship while also blaspheming God as much as possible. He's not content even with transferring the rest from Saturday to Sunday, and by so doing receiving obedience and worship from the world. He wants to also simultaneously blaspheme God as much as possible while he receives worship. He is complete hatred, he is complete jealousy, he is complete evil and spite. He is the father of lies. It's truly astounding. And this article, for me, was new information because I didn't know that Saturday was dedicated to Mary all these years. And I also didn't know that all these appearances were on the Sabbath, which is so profound, but it totally makes sense. It totally makes sense. Satan appearing as Mary on the Sabbath and associating worship of himself on that day, that God is supposed to be worshipped, is the ultimate blasphemy. And with the sleight of hand from Saturday to Sunday, it's just increasing blasphemy and adding to the heresy over time. Have you ever wondered and asked yourself, here's a simple question with all these things, and certainly Catholics don't have an answer to it, but have you ever wondered why Mary apparitions didn't happen in the 1st century, or 2nd century, or 3rd century? If Mary is in heaven as the Queen of Heaven and guiding the church, why was she absent in those first couple centuries where the church needed a lot of guidance? Why were there no Marian apparitions during that time? And the simple answer is, my friends, is because the early church, especially in the 1st century, was Jewish. They didn't believe in people floating up to heaven. And they certainly wouldn't have believed an apparition of Mary telling them these various things. Do you get it? The culture had to be shaped. The immortality of the soul had to be worked in. Sunday sacredness had to be worked in. Sabbath fasting had to be worked in. The Jewish traditions had to be separated and destroyed and demonized. And once you had the mystery of iniquity set, now we can start proclaiming these more and more blasphemies. It's the mystery of iniquity, the mystery Babylon's gospel, the gospel of Babylon, the inverse of all things. Some Catholic legends and traditions say that Mary appeared to a few people, but in the early church, but these things, even the church themselves don't recognize these as official appearances, and they're not well documented. And we know, we know from other examples that Rome loves to create documentations to justify itself before it actually existed. Like the Liber Pontificales, where you have the succession of popes since Peter, which of course that was written in the 6th century, and it's backdated. So, we have apostolic succession. The donation of Constantine, all these things. So don't believe these, legends and writings that Mary appeared to the early church and that's nonsense. Lies. They're lies. And again, if Mary was the Queen of Heaven and she's so important in guiding the church, where were the appearances in the first couple hundred years? They aren't, because nobody would have believed it. That's why. But this is how the devil works. Gradually, and eventually it takes over. But doing so, making Saturday the day of Mary, and basically making it secondary to Sunday, you're basically making both days worship for Satan. You have Saturday is now devoted to Mary, and you're worshiping a false Christ through that, which is really Satan, and pretending to come and be your savior through Mary and intercede for you and promise you salvation. And you're then worshiping and obeying Satan again by obeying the pontifex's order to transfer the rest on Sunday. It is maximum sin and maximum blasphemy. As much as you could possibly blaspheme, Satan has managed to do that, which is really profound. All the while blaspheming and mocking God every chance he gets. Today in modern culture, we have the weekend, the idea of the weekend, which simultaneously programs people to think that Sunday is the end of the week. So therefore, I can finally rest, it's Sunday, while encouraging work and partying and every other kind of thing on Saturday. I've talked about this in my series, but the weekend is a deception. There's a deception designed to lull you into a state of comfort, because Saturday is actually Sunday is the first day of the week. According to Constantine, it's the first day of the week. So the weekend is actually Friday, Saturday. And so you have to get out of that thinking. Even if you're keeping the Sabbath, just try to remember that you're using it colloquially if you use that word, but the weekend is actually Friday, Saturday for us who keep the Sabbath. So wrapping it up, gosh, there was a lot to talk about. The history we covered in this section, unfortunately, is just barely scratching the surface. Like the other sections, I just wanted to give you points so you could see the mystery of iniquity going out into the world. There are books upon books upon books documenting the spiritual war over people's minds and hearts that ensued after the cross, and which continues today, and which will culminate in the mark of the beast. The original church kept the Sabbath because the apostles kept the Sabbath, and history proves that very clearly. Over time, Satan used everything at his disposal, spiritual, political, physical, psychological, to shape the culture, infiltrate, and basically proclaim his counterfeit morality. Today, we're at the end of that history, and history is going to repeat very quickly, so learn your history. The fasting dialectics that began in the 2nd and 3rd century with the Gnostics in Rome made the Sabbath a burden and created the justification for Sunday as the day of joy and rest that people look forward to. But remember, that wasn't all throughout the empire. It took a long time for that to be enforced. Rome was given authority to rule by God, so it eventually conquered turf and grew stronger and stronger, enforcing its morality over time. Watch my DDMP series to see the constant conflicts of the papacy and how it basically forced it to reveal its fangs and assess its authority and world domination aspirations. But these things ultimately revealed the Antichrist power on the earth because it was the will of God that this power is revealed. It's not revealed because it's some Antichrist in the future. And certainly if you're a preterist, the word revealed doesn't make any sense because the preterist position is something in the past and that doesn't need to be revealed. It's revealed because this power is deceptive and posing as the will of God, but it's actually satanic. That's why it needs to be revealed. Eventually, the fasting dialectics split the church up in two, but by then, the job was done, and basically Satan started to change gears and associate the Sabbath more and more to Mary through signs and wonders and miracles on those days and apparitions to basically transfer even more attention to Saturday and blaspheme God and give people no chance to learn the truth about the Sabbath. Meanwhile, Islam was going out and basically conquering the world. You had persecutions and pressures from Islam to not keep the Sabbath and be like Jews. You had the Romans and the Roman authorities through the Holy Roman Empire like Charlemagne and the dialectics going on there throughout all of Europe and the British Isles. And Rome's influence continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And Sabbath keepers were just little pockets of people here and there, and it was forgotten. And even the ones that remembered it, they succumbed to traditions of men themselves, as we clearly documented. When the Reformation happened, Protestants lost from the very beginning because they were refuted by the Catholics for their clinging to traditions of men. They clung to Sunday as a tradition of the church and therefore acknowledged the authority of the Pope. And so they are hypocrites. And we'll be documenting that quite a bit in the next section. But the rest, as they say, is history, my friends. The rest, as they say, is history. I've documented 2,000 years of history on Sunday laws, and and Sunday persecutions, both in this series and in the Sabbath series, the original one. And they all tell you the same thing. I've also documented the pagan origins of Sunday, which was married to Christian practice by Constantine. And unfortunately, most people don't see the issue today because they don't know their history. They aren't patient enough to go through these things and learn. But hopefully you will learn and be on the right side of history. When you obey the command to rest on Sunday and cease from working and commerce, you are obeying the devil as the giver of the law. This is the issue. It's not about when you go to church. It's not about when you choose to worship God. It's about when you choose to obey the command to rest physically. And that's the problem. Christians gathered on Sundays, there's nothing wrong with that. But Christians for hundreds of years never considered Sunday as a day to cease from working. And that's an important point that more people need to be aware of. The issue is resting on Sunday, because through that rest, you acknowledge Satan as the provider, the authority, the redeemer that you are in alignment with. It is what your obedience says through your actions. And now that we're at the end, where Satan has total control of the world through technology and secret societies and everything else, he is going to enforce his morality of the counterfeit gospel. And people will obey. The most of the world will obey. So this is why the word of the day is, and always will be, remember. Now onward to the next section of this, which is going to be a short recapitulation of everything that we've looked at. All right. Well, I want to spend a little bit of time to recapitulate everything that we've looked at, because we've looked at a lot of history in the previous sections. So I want to get a bird's eye view and just kind of do the highlight and the main points. In the next section, we're going to be looking at major quotes on the origins of Sunday as a tradition of the Catholic Church from original sources so that you can see for yourself. And again, there's many Seventh-day Adventists or Sabbath-keeping sites that document these things, but they are often spurious, misquoted, or miscited. And that's why I want to look at original sources so that there's absolutely no doubt. So that you not think I'm citing a Seventh-day Adventist site or a Torah-keeping site or whatever else. Because the history is very clear. So, hopefully by now you already know the truth, but let's recapitulate everything we've gone through. In the first century church kept the Sabbath and Passover as Easter because they were Jews. We have lots of documentation that this is the case, with some of the earliest being the Didache, using the Day of Preparation lingo, which is a Sabbath-keeping term. And that was in like 100-something AD. There's also the Quartodeciman controversy in the church during the first couple hundred years, with the date of Easter being either Passover or the Sunday. And that began and lasted for a few centuries until these people were eventually called heretics. But the early church also suffered persecution immediately, first from their own kind, the Jews, and then from the Romans. These persecutions made the case for preparing people to basically accept this counterfeit Sabbath by separating from anything Jewish. And it put pressure on the church to find an identity apart from Jewish roots, which is an important shift that needed to happen. Add to this pagan converts that were not Jewish and had no appreciation of these things, who saw the Jews as being hypocrites on the Sabbath, either because of their legalism or their sloth. And they also associated the Sabbath to the Mosaic covenant as a result, and their thoughts shaped reality. Add to this, again, the influence of Gnosticism, both in creating an atmosphere to over-spiritualize the Bible in general, and in also hating the Jews, because part of Gnosticism was the teaching that the God of the Old Testament was this evil evil God, and Jesus came to rescue us from that. So all of these things together was working hard and hard on the first century church to traumatize it from multiple angles so that ultimately the culture could start to be shaped in the 2nd and 3rd century. In the 2nd and 3rd century, for about 200 years, they were extremely influential in the evolution of Sunday replacing the Sabbath. In the wake of all the persecution and Gnosticism and Jew-hating and pagan conversions and yada, 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 an opportunity for the devil was opened to shape the culture. He did this through influencers like Clement, Origen, Justin Martyr, and so on. But remember that these people were not at any way representative of the majority. They weren't. They were minority voices, but they wrote a lot, and so they were basically being very influential. Also, forgeries and legends like the Ignatius of Antioch letters or the Epistle of Barnabas, which is not written by the real Ignatius or Barnabas, were part of Satan's schemes. And remember, even in the New Testament, it talks about false letters. So this is part of Satan's strategy, is to create false things that justify his power and basically his sleight of hand. Today, Ignatius' letters or Clement or Origen are cited as if they're representative of the mainstream Christian attitudes, but they're not. Not at all. This is not true whatsoever. They were minority voices. And yet their works influenced a lot of policy in the future, and that's why they were significant. Because Satan sets precedents. He does something just like God. He copies what God does, so he can create precedents, and then he seems justified. After all of the writing by Augustine and Clement and Origen and Justin Martyr, it seemed right and good that the Council of Laodicea would follow in the footsteps of the pagan Constantine and enforce Christians resting on Sunday, and Sunday's the day for us Christians and so on. So it just built on top of each other through all of these successive fake witnesses, false witnesses. In this time period, the church was continuing to grow and spread throughout the world through missionary work. And because of that, it's clear from looking at early history of these churches that the majority of the Eastern churches kept the Sabbath, and this was the case for centuries, even after Constantine. Another important development during this time was the tradition of fasting on the Sabbath. And of course, part of this tradition came from Gnosticism with Marcion very early on, and who knows who else. But nevertheless, it got threaded into the Catholic Church, into the Bishop of Rome, because the Bishop of Rome is where the devil gave his throne and power and great authority to. So everything has to be threaded into that office. Gnosticism definitely influenced Christianity. There was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiments. So this began very early, and the Sabbath fasting came probably organically from Christians who thought maybe it was a good idea. There was also the Gnostic element. Who knows exactly how it came about, but we know that it was Antichrist to begin with. In the 200s, Calixtus of Rome pronounced the fast on the Sabbath a few times per year, beginning the tradition. And then you had the 300s. Sylvester continues the practice, and basically Rome begins to enforce it more and more. And supposedly Sylvester also dedicated that practice, or was it Innocent? I think it was Innocent actually that said for the Virgin Mary. Whether it's Sylvester or Innocent, the association to Mary being sad on the Sabbath and fasting, that also happened very early on. So you could see the dialectics building in the threads from the very, very beginning. Either way, this practice was debated for centuries afterward, and through these debates and through these debacles, we can track that people kept the Sabbath as a day of joy, delight, and rest, especially in the East, through all of the things that we looked at. Now, the 4th century was when all of these dialectics would reach a climax, and political changes would galvanize the sleight of hand that the devil had done and built up to all of this time to basically move the sabbatical aspect, the resting aspect, from the 7th day to the 1st day. In 306, the Council of Avira was one of the first councils, and it regulated fasting on the Sabbath, and it also prescribed, how you should go to church, and if you don't go to church on Sunday more than 3 times in a row, you're going to be shut out from Christ. And so this is an important council because it shows you the church was already beginning to compromise and being led by the culture and wanting to fit in and not be persecuted and so on. In 313, 7 years later, Constantine's Edict of Milan ended the persecution and set the stage for unification of Christianity to the Roman Empire by creating the state religion eventually, which would be the compromised church. A few years later, in 321, Constantine declared his famous pagan statute, a Sunday law that standardized the calendar and basically added the sabbatical aspect to the first day of the week. 2 years later, Satan appeared to Constantine and deceived him into unifying church and state for the good. 2 years after that, Pope Sylvester proclaims fasting on Saturday, and along with Eusebius and everybody starts to say that Sunday is the day that we rest. We've transferred it to Sunday. 40 years after that, around the 360s, you had the Council of Laodicea that warned Christians not to Judaize, but actually work on the Sabbath and keep Sunday holy. And this particular document, called the Sunday Letter, was circulated for centuries as propaganda to subjugate Sabbath-keeping communities throughout the Christian world, as you saw from Ireland and Scotland and other places in the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, with Charlemagne and so on. 20 years after that, in 386, there were more civil transactions that were prohibited on Sundays and legal cases, spectacles, and so on. So there were more and more restrictions over time and basically adding to this day. And of course, meanwhile, all these political changes were happening. Culture shaping was maximizing through, again, people like Augustine, Eusebius, Ephraim, all these think tanks that were pumping out compromised theology and spiritualizing everything with Gnostic ideas. Continuing hatred against the Jews only magnified these things, and continuing division over fasting between East and West pushed people to make a choice. You got to make a choice. Which one do you go with? Make a choice. It's always been about who do you obey. Now, in the 5th century and beyond, with the aftermath of all of these things, you had many things happening. With the social political changes of the 4th century, the sleight of hand that happened was now ready to be exported to the entire church so that Satan could obtain obedience. And of course, that took a long time, and we're still in that process, but Satan is going to be successful at the very end to actualize this desire. In 401, Pope Innocent proclaimed Saturday as a fasting day for the West, associating it to the Virgin Mary also. 425, even more civil transactions were prohibited, like I think that was the one that prohibited public spectacles. But either way, there's successive things that are happening to increasingly, make this a more sacred day. In the 7th century, Muhammad comes around, and Islam basically puts pressure on Eastern Christians not to Judaize, just like the Romans did. From the 8th to the 10th centuries, you start to see reforms in the Holy Roman Empire, like with Charlemagne, echoing pressure on the Sabbath-keeping Christians, just like they had in the 4th century. We also know that Roman missionaries conquer Sabbath-keeping communities and eventually subjugate them to Rome from like Ireland and things like that, from the history of those places that we can see. In the 11th century, you see the Great Schism with many dialectics over the fasting issue on the Sabbath. Around this time also, Rome begins relaxing the fasting tradition and pushing Mary idolatry, and you start seeing Marian apparitions and so on coming from that point in time. The 12th century and beyond, you have the papacy enforcing obedience, Sunday laws, inquisitions, persecutions. By the 16th century, you have the Protestant Reformations, and they kept Sunday tradition. And by the 17th century, the Pilgrims take that tradition to America. They have hardcore Sunday laws, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Today, nobody is the wiser, my friends, because people have forgotten. They have forgotten just as God prophesied that people would forget. If you want to have more documentation on the history of the Sunday laws, see episode 8 of my Sabbath series. We go through plenty of them there. And that's just scratching the surface, folks. This has been going on since the dawn of the church age. People need to learn their history so they can remember a very important truth, which is that this truth has been forgotten, and it's going to be the truth of the coming months and years that the final chapters of Revelation are unfolding in. It's going to be the issue. It's going to be the issue, and we'll get clarity on what the mark of the beast actually is, because it's not just Sunday laws. It's not about Sunday laws. Sunday laws are an expression of the mark of the beast. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a deeper understanding of that. But the point is this: do not be like the rest of the world, my friends. Do not be like the rest of the world. Do not conform yourself to the world and forget. Do not be like the rest of the world and forget, but rather learn and help others with this information so they too can learn and be edified. Now, onward into more history with traditions of men.
If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honourable, and shalt honour him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. And I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father. For the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it.